Good morning, everyone. Could everybody please grab whatever you need to sustain you for the next hour in terms of coffee, tea, apricots, help yourself to all of it. I'm Kath Scanlon, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here to the London School of Economics, to this lovely room, which can't be said about a lot of the rooms at LSE, but this one is nice. This is the new PhD Academy, so this is where our PhD students get to hang out when we're not using it. This is the final event or final seminar in our ESRC seminar series. The lead organizer is Helen Jarvis, and I'll turn it over to her to give us an introduction to the series.
Thanks, Kath and Melissa. Just to provide a little bit of context, it will be a bit of repetition for those of our regular participants who we're very grateful to see today. So my name's Helen Jarvis, and I'm from Newcastle University, and I'm welcoming you today on behalf of a team of organisers. This is the final event in a series of, a programme of action research, which has included various site visits to real-life examples of co-housing at various stages of development, as well as these sort of 6 more scholarly seminars, where we've explored a number of research themes, critical questions, really trying to frame a research agenda. We're not providing answers, we're largely asking questions and pushing and challenging the frontiers of academic research, very much side by side with practitioners and policymakers and anyone else who can engage meaningfully with this theme of collaborative housing and community resilience. So along the way, we've hosted seminars at Newcastle, Leeds, Lancaster, Nottingham, Sheffield, and today at the LSE. So I'm conscious that we haven't hosted in Wales and Scotland. We have tried to represent UK issues, but we're also putting UK in a kind of landscape of a wider conceptual inquiry of co-housing and community-based housing and collaborative housing in its broadest sort of sense, probing some of these definitions along the way. Key to action-oriented research, which this programme has tried to sort of embrace as an approach, has been our partnership with the UK Co-housing Network. And we'll have Anna Keir, who's Executive Director of UKCN, here later on today. Very rarely, in my experience, is our scholarly research events co-produced and really embedded in practice-based engagement. But I'm quite proud to say that this seminar series has been co-produced and embedded in that practice-based engagement all along the way. At the same time as not losing sight of the fact that this is a research seminar series, asking critical questions. So we wanted to try and lift some of the discussion, from real-life dilemmas of getting co-housing built and evidencing it and evaluating and looking at the social and ecological gains, but asking critical and probing questions and challenging scholars to bring forward relevant, evidence-based, robust research. But our aim is really to create a bigger conversation, and the key to this has been the participation of people like yourself, and I'm seeing familiar faces here in the audience. We have already produced a short film to sort of try to make some observations about how that bigger conversation has unfolded, and over the lunchtime we'll have that film available to view. You'll see some of yourselves in it, and some of the previous events. It's just one of the forms of sort of impact evidence that we're producing for the seminar series, and that will outlive this final event in the 2-year series. Important to note that we have 4 or 5 months beyond this seminar before we sort of close down officially the sort of the programme of research and continue to publish from. But in that time frame, we really want to hear more from you. So we want to hear what kind of activities, initiatives, projects have in some part been inspired by this series. Do keep in touch with us. We will actually be asking for you, sort of surveying your opinion on this. Because it's really important that we actually sort of demonstrate that these conversations are impactful and influential in that respect. Before sort of handing over and identifying sort of other important people here in the room, I wanted to point to the fact that we are going to be using social media for this event. We have the at Cohousing Resilience. There's also the at LSE London. This seminar is funded by the Economic Social Research Council, which is one of the research councils of the UK. Because of the quirks of the fact that we are in an apparent period of purdah in the run-up to the big event on Thursday, please, it's fine if we talk about the ESRC in this room, but if you're going to use social media, please don't hashtag ESRC. Strictly speaking, the ESRC can't be attributed to anything we talk about today as a public funded body in this period running up to the referendum, even though we're not talking about referendum. It is important that we don't get into anyone's bad books on that, but please do use social media. So now, to end this, I just want to thank Kath Scanlon and Melissa Fernandez, who are the LSE co-applicants who've organised today. Other co-applicants in the room here are Dermot O'Reilly from Lancaster, Fian Stevenson from Sheffield, so they've hosted separate events. A co-applicant UK Co-Housing Network, which is Anna Keir, just coming into the room, who you'll be introduced to further later on. So particular thanks to Melissa and Kath. Other co-applicants who couldn't be with us today are Lucy Sargison from Nottingham and Paul Chatterton from Leeds. But on that point, I want to hand over to Melissa, who's going to introduce the sort of broader theme, because each of the seminars has a particular theme, and Melissa's going to take you off today.
Welcome, everybody. Very nice to see familiar faces and new faces around the table. Oh, I should say, we're also live streaming the event today, so if anybody has any problems with that later on, you can always edit out certain sections and just come to me or release this. And I should identify 2 other people that are in the room that are helping out. So if you need, if you have any questions, housekeeping questions, you come to Ulysses or to Miranda, who's in the back with the camera, or me or Kath. And the loos, this one is broken, so you need to go up 1 flight of stairs from the same door that you came in, and just walk up 1 flight of stairs, and there's both female and male bathrooms up there. So yeah, I'm just going to say something for 2 minutes, because you'll all have really the information about what today is meant to be about. Each of the seminar series, like Helen was saying, has kind of covered a particular topic. So we've had mutual aid, we've had aging, we've had issues of design and the common house. So today the idea was to kind of bring all of that together and think more broadly in terms of how can we actually influence policy making, how can we connect with local authorities, with housing associations. Crucially, how do we address the topic of finance? So all these things start to come together when we start to think about mainstreaming. How do we mainstream co-housing? And what are the kind of barriers, what are the kind of opportunities that exist in the UK at the moment? But also, the way that we designed the program is to bring in international speakers. So we have Anna from the Netherlands and Marco from Berlin, which are countries that, at least in the popular imagination, have a much more mainstream co-housing culture. These projects are much more common. The local authorities tend to support them, some more than others. Political contexts are different to hear, but we wanted to hear from them. What are the opportunities there? What have been the challenges over time historically? And what can the UK learn from them? So that's more or less the thinking behind the design of the day. And then finally, we'll have a panel at the end of the day that brings together designers and independent researchers from the UK, co-housing consultants, to speak about, what the opportunities from their perspective are for the UK. What are some of the kind of game changers? What are some of the policy asks that we could be asking from the government at this point in time? And that will kind of feed into tomorrow's event. I don't know how many of you will be able to attend, hopefully a lot of you, but we're having the launch of our actual report from the seminar series in Parliament. And the idea behind that is to kind of go to government and say, this is what we've learned. These are our key points. These are our key policy asks to the government, but also from co-housing groups, from local authorities, etc. So the final portion of the day after the panel, hopefully will get us all thinking about, what do we want to tell government tomorrow? We have a report, but we also want to take feedback from today there, and whoever's here that can kind of contribute to that discussion tomorrow would be great. But also we'll take that feedback with us and have a think about it and amend, what we've already kind of come up with for tomorrow. I think I'll leave it there, and we have as our first speaker Anna.
Can I take my chair?
Yes, of course.
I'll bring some more.
So Anna is from the Dutch Federation of Intergenerational Intentional Communities, and she can. Oh,
If she
sorry.
likes.
We can also move. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, we're going to move.
Is it okay if we film you?
for the live
is
streaming?
this
Is
not
that all right?
good?
No,
No, that's
is it
fine, we
okay if
can
we
move
film
it.
you? We
You
can.
can just move it.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it over with
Well,
I'll turn.
Anna, did you have a presentation that you want something?
No,
On the
there will
computer.
be some pictures, but
Ulysses will
I
do
got
it.
it.
Okay.
no, but, oh yes, that's the first one. Well, I'd like very much to be here. And, I have the idea that I'm asked to tell you something about co-housing in Holland, and then focusing on a concept or a word that I didn't know and know now, and that's social enabler. So I don't know whether you have any idea what that means, but this has to do with developing projects, and everybody knows that you can't develop a project, certainly when it's newly built, without an architect. But I think many people think they can social enablers, well, not really necessarily we can do that ourselves. At least I know that very well. Because I'm telling you a little, I'm trying to tell you about the then and the now. And I am from the then, and I have developed into the now. And I want to start with thinking about what are main motives why people want to live community. So the leading question is the question of the 5 W's, and that's what do people want to do communally, why, where, when, and with whom. I think these are the main questions that you have to deal with and you have to answer. Impossible in half an hour now, of course. But I will tell you, when in the 80s, there was in Rotterdam, there was a certain percentage of the newly built houses should be fit for communal living. And there were a lot of people, young people especially, who were interested in living communally, but they didn't have a group, or a core group. So there were loose individuals, can someone say that? Free individuals who wanted to connect themselves, but only lightly. And but they had to get to know each other. So it was a room like this, and there were about 20, 30 persons, and I was there and asked to, can you help them forming groups? And of course, the first thing that it has all to do with the why and the motivations and the expectations. So you start with helping people exchange their expectations and their motivations. And there is already one task for the social enabler, and that is promote the brainstorming, but at the same time be aware that not everybody is as well find it easy to talk about the expectations and the image they have of co-housing. So it's important to make everybody connected to what is going to happen, to take your time and to help people express themselves. It's very, very important. It's a social enabler task. Why? Why do they? Well, I remember a young man in the 80s, one of this group, loose-free individuals, and when he was talking about his motivation, he said, well, when I'm at home, I dislike it very much that I have to put on shoes and my coat to meet another nice person and have a pleasant conversation. And I do not intend to marry for that reason. So that's why I want to live communally. I remember that it made quite an impression on me. And then lately, we have a lot of co-housing projects, but a lot is not a very clear concept or idea. Several hundreds. And a lot of these co-housing projects, which are called Centraal Wonen, and it's called that way because it started with a housewife who said, are there any architects, she made some PR around that, who want to develop with future residents a project with centrally a communal space with a central kitchen and a place where we can eat together every day a week, and around that the private area, the private houses. And that started the movement, and that's why it's called Centraal Wonen, living centrally wonen. So I mix these words, co-housing and Centraal Wonen sometimes. We visited the project that was the first that was developed. It took, I think, 7 years. It's in Hilversum near Amsterdam. And we, as the editors of our quarterly, because we are having this project of visiting the project that exist more than 35 years now. So we were there, and there was a representation of, in this project like that, there are different generations living in the project, and not generations of the same age, but the time they came into the project. They have different ideas about communal living, because this is, of course, developing. And sometimes this really clashes, and how can you manage these clashes? And one of the, a woman of about 40 came and lived there now a little bit more than a year. And we asked her why she came to live in Centraal Wonen Hilversum, Cohousing Hilversum. And she said, well, I'm single, I have very many friends, I'm 40, I have a very good life in Amsterdam, but someone was lacking. And I heard about this project in Hilversum, I visited it, and I thought immediately, this is what I want, and I hope that I will be chosen when there's a vacancy. Because it's quite an interesting and tricky material being chosen into the project. And I heard a new word from you, prospective residents. Yes, there are all kinds of finding prospective residents. And in some projects in Rotterdam, they call that you have to make the prospective residents integrated. Only integrated prospective residents have a chance when there is a vacancy. That's what people learned later. But what did she find in Hilversum? She says, what I found is, although I had a very good life with friends, I have found a sense of connectedness. There are people around, physically near, but also social near, and there is a certain intimacy. I call it again light relations, light but important relations. And she said, I have found that I found here everything I hoped for. Well, after a 1.5 year experience, that means something, I think. And she said, it is also because of the world is getting more and more individualistic, more and more connected with the mobile, and harder. I think society is harder and more individualistic, and that's why it's more important than getting more and more important. I personally think, you all have your own ideas and experiences with this, but I think that when you really talk about co-housing, this is the main motivation for most people. Of course, there are many other motivations that are almost as important and bringing energy in yourself, in oneself. But I think this is the main one. but when I compare then and the now, and I try to compare it on the level of motivation and expectations and images of co-housing, I think the changes, of course, we call it the communal movement. I don't know whether you know the movement. It was at the same time as the second women's emancipation movement, and it was of course the 60s and the 70s. And this communal movement, which was rather influenced certainly in Germany, but also in Holland, that was the time of activism and very ideologically based ways of communal housing, with people being totally free in relations and using light drugs, and this image still sticks to co-housing in Holland, and I don't know whether it happened like this in England too, but I said it must have been so. So the new co-housing projects are much more practical, and I think they know their limits. And besides, they have learned a lot in this communal period, in being free love, and experimental with all these situations. And I don't know whether some of you have seen the picture Collectivet, which is a Danish picture of the, yes, and well, if you want to have an idea which is not very positive, and I have friends who are very angry about it, but it is not a very attractive image, what is presented in this picture. But there is some truth in it, I think. One of the initiators in the Hilversum project, which exists now for 40 years, she said, when we visited them, where the lady of 40 lives too, she said, I have been a bad mother because my children didn't like it, but we just went on with the project and the experiment. And she said, and that's why I think that my children do not want to live communally. So these are interesting themes. They're now much more practical. I think many of these projects I know function in well, personally they think you must practice what you preach, but they also have a certain hope or belief in the example effects of look, watch. And they open up. Every year there is opening up the co-housing project, and everybody can visit them to get to know it better. So these are two of know that there are more differences. There is of course the difference that these people now are much more ecologically oriented, if you can say that, you understand what I mean? This means that they want to take responsibility as a co-housing project, and personally a footprint responsibility, I would call it. And they are interested in green technology. Of course, that's new, and it's very motivating. But you can feel that this is almost as important as the social being connected feeling. Then a general thing that's happening is more luxury. So people want much more personal space. So for themselves, the ideal is more or less. Everybody wants a living room, a kitchen where you can eat at least, an eating room, and a sleeping room, and an extra room for studying. So it's about 3 spaces, 3 rooms per person. That's the ideal now. And so that's a difference. When in the communal period there was very few rooms private, and a lot of rooms communal shared, also the facilities like bathrooms, etc. So, well, then with whom are you going to live? How does the group grow? Well, in the beginning, for the communes, it was you must more or less accept and underline and go for our ideological aims. And If you do, you're welcome. And join the club. And now it is, people are much thinking differently. The co-housing project from the early 70s, they still had ideas of, well, people who want this are good people, and we want to live with the world, so everybody's welcome. And people learned later that it is not as easy in practice as they had hoped for, of course. So there are ways that projects are preparing, attracting, recruiting, and selecting new member procedures, which is rather delicate business, because I remember a project in Zeist where the architect with whom I worked together in the Centraal Wonen Delft project, I'll tell a little bit more about that later, and he worked in a project in an area in Holland where there live relatively many anthroposophical oriented people. And they started with a Centraal Wonen group, a co-housing group. Nothing anthroposophical, but they started the project in that area. And so the group they had an architect and a design, and everything was going smoothly. But there came more and more anthroposophical members, and these anthroposophical members who all lived around there said, you must come to the meetings, and if you have meetings in meetings, you will have your ticket for the project. So what happened is that the initiators really seriously thought about leaving the project if this would go on, but the word anthroposophisch was an impossible word to use. And I was asked as a social enabler to try to cope with this problem. And ultimately, it was quite, for me, difficult meeting. I think I really said, I should consider and try to explain that there is an anthroposophical stop from now. Because otherwise the initiators and the core group that has started it all and bring it as far, it is not their project anymore. And these things, this is an extreme example of a real important thing. How heterogeneous, is that the correct word? Can you get relatively easy? Can you really make function? So there's a little bit more, less shame for starting with and attracting and recruiting new members procedures. And I heard that from one of the women who is here, that they work already that way, and I congratulated with that, because most people didn't dare. Just really there. Well, what has the enabler to do in I have to fetch more glasses. Otherwise I say. Oh yes, it's recorded one earlier.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes? No, that's not mine. Maybe it's in, maybe I've left it somewhere. No. Yes, I think it is. Yeah, thank you. I'll see. Oh, that's much better. Yes. Yes, yeah, technical and are welcome as well, of course. So the first process, if you have the group, is making the exchange after the motivations and expectations, the exchange of co-housing images. Now, architects are very good at imaging, and imaging is happening here somewhere. You can only discuss the images and each other's images if you present them. Yes. And presenting them demands certain skills, but also guts. And also, not everybody is conscious of his or her co-housing image. So there is a lot to be done for the social enabling. For instance, what the COE also has to do is everybody knows that in this meeting, as soon as there is no one who's sitting in front and has a task, they start to communicating, and quite soon some people are verbally very active and others are listening very active. And it is important that everybody has the feeling that he can find him or herself back in the shared image that is ultimately the result of the sharing and discussing of images. But everybody has to present his or her image. So you have to make them conscious and to help them present it and to tell that, because when you have an expert in the group, an architect, wonderful for the group, but you must check him. When you have verbally very strong people in the group, wonderful in external context and things, use these capacities, but they shouldn't dominate in the meetings where people share images and make decisions. And that's very important. How it's not easy, and it's very important. Check that dominance, but at the same time, keep it contributive to the group. So, because the expertise is nothing to be ashamed of, a verbal fluent neither, but you have to check it. And what also is more important than many people think is make room for minority ideas and images. Because very often there are ideas, and then the first reaction of the group, it's not so strange. Oh, no, she wants to meditate here, and things like that. You have to make it possible to really honestly give some time to this idea. I have found out that it is very fruitful. Then, guarantee documentation, of course. Making minutes for what it's called, and the quality. And keep an eye on the group process. That is how about the numbers? Are they prepared are they involved? How can we make them involved? And you keep an eye on that, and that's our main task in this period of social enablement. And at the same time, he or she has to be unobtrusive, which is not so easy, and because you have to be present, and she has to be independent. I know many groups where, and the Delft project is an example where Philip Rabbenam, who's the architect of this project, and took 11 years to develop it, was more or less certainly the architectural enabler, but partly also the social enabler. He lived in a squatted house, and the meetings were there, and it was his idea. He was a student, and he finished his studies with this project. And I think that went rather well, but that was because he was, if I may say so, I read it somewhere. I don't know if you understand what I mean. He was the exception. And it's very seldom happens. He was really a par inter pares. He was not the primus inter pares, no, just one of them. And he wanted to live in the project as well, which is a disadvantage. He still lives there after, but I think that the social enabler should not be a future resident, and the architect is the same. Better not, unless you find this exceptional person, but the social enabling process is even more tricky. And I also think that when you have groups of over 20, that there should be 2 enablers together. Certainly at meetings where far-reaching decisions are being taken. Because I hope you can, you think, why? Maybe you would ask, I would have to answer it, but it is a feeling and it is an experience, because there are always two persons always have different energy, and it is always some of the people who participate are more attracted to one of them and to the other, and they always are complementary. And secondly, they can check between themselves what happened, and if you took it rightly, but it is probably a financial matter, but at the same time, just it is my experience that it is much better. And on the position of the architects, well, here you can see that it is really 70s. Yeah. We started a little bit. The images have been exchanged. There were some ideas about what is it going to be, and four groups of future residents developed a project. They called this the anarchist approach, and it was just what would it be like, and I did it very well, but I don't know the word in English of language. It's what the children do in the it's quite easy just building things, but there are ideas about how to develop that in totally different structures. And this was one of them, just showing you how it worked and how these three of these results were talked about, and that resulted, I haven't got that now, but that resulted in the project that we will see a little bit later. But Philip is going on with developing this, and now he has developed a plane or a system in which different layers of communality have play a part in developing the project. But I will tell you that later. About the architects, about the architects, they have changed, the architect then and the architect now. The architect then, in the 70s, at least in Holland, the attitude of the architect at that time was, well, there was a saying between user-client-oriented architects, and that was the architect should be the pencil of the resident, of the user client. So completely, well, service the client. And some people really did, some architects really did that, but it was at that time. And now Philip, I asked Philip and he said, well, I didn't use that expression, but more or less I functioned like that. And I have changed my mind, because I think now that the architect should listen very carefully to the user clients, not the paying client, especially to the user clients, but he must take his professional responsibility. And sometimes they didn't do that in the 70s, and then there are some malfunctioning, but also projects that are considered ugly or something like that. And, oh yes, I can do it that way. When I have, this is very sophisticated, but I won't tell any more about it because it would be too long. I want to go to the next, thank you. Oh yes, these two, is this the first one is the idea of what the facade would look like if people really started to influence it. There were possibilities to arrange the structure of their part of the facade, and they hoped for that. But what really happened, it's an architecture question, and the other one here is what he is a little bit happy with what really happened, but it is much less. There was a color scheme made by the residents, and this color scheme still exists. But that's so much for the influence of the residents. I'll tell you some conclusions. If you have finished this phase, correctly or not fruitfully, then there is you have a shared co-housing image, which really is the result of fruitful exchange of personal images. And the testing of these images has happened, and these private images are really integrated in the shared vision. And the assets that are the result of this process, that you have a new client architect, you have found you have a site where you can build, you have a corporation or a developer, or you develop it yourself, the paying client as well, and you are starting the juridical things, making a statute and things like that. And so you can now start, finish the design process, and after that the building, but I won't go that far. I will focus on some main design decisions. So I can still do that. I think it's if you have main design decisions, one is the size, how many households. The model house, the model size. Can I say model? Yeah. A model size is 30 or 50 households. But there are much larger co-housing projects in Holland as well, about 100 households. You've seen them. And it's very personal, and I leave that the size thing. I'm going to a thing that probably most people have to deal with in this decision-making period for the design program, and that is communal space. What, how much, and where. And there are two main decisions made on this subject, and it is: do you want to have all the communal space connected, so concentrated, and meant for all people who live in the project? So this general space should big enough to contain all residents and some guests maybe, so you can eat there, meet each other, have festivities and things like that. And it's advisable the location is more or less centrally. This is a concept that is derived from many Danish projects. There are family houses, very many family houses, and there's one communal, so-called Fellas House, where the communal meeting and things happen. But in co-housing in Centraal Wonen, we have discovered during this long period that the project in Delft was developed, that there should be more differentiation, and that the communal spaces should be dispersed, some of it over the project. Certainly if the project is quite large, many people. If you have 100 people, you are not certain anymore whether it's one of the neighbors or belonging to the project. That's less attractive from your co-housing point of view. But these model projects, we had a lot of talk in the Delft project about groups, and whether it would not be necessary, because I asked the question also, what do you want together? And if you want to eat once a month together, of course, that can be in a general kitchen and eating facilities. But if you want to eat together regularly during the week, it's not practical and also hardly feasible to arrange that. So a lot of administration. Eating together is a good number is about 10, 12. Not very many more, otherwise you don't know who forgot to wash it up and took a pen with him at home and didn't return. This is one of the reasons, but the other reason is a thing like eating habit and daily hours. Do you have small children? You want to eat at 6 o'clock and child friendly. If you come late, home tired, you want to eat after 8 o'clock and with wine and take your time afterwards. It's different. And so they decided to develop some spaces for smaller numbers of people, and they are called cluster space. It's called cluster space. But in Delft, these clusters, they are about 20, 30 persons. They even thought that was a little bit too large for eating together, so they divided the clusters in 2 or 3 kitchen groups of about 10, 12 people at the most, persons at the most. So Delft, when you're going to Delft, this is also Delft. Oh yeah, this is Delft. Well, what you see is this is private space. The yellow ones, but I'm a bit surprised. Well, this is cluster space. The level of the project is this, the colors are green, but this is the project, centrally, the general communal space. And then the yellow is for groups, and this color is cluster space, the orange, more or less orange. These are the layers in Delft. And I will go to the next picture. Oh yes, thank you, sorry. That's okay. Rotterdam, Centraal Rotterdam, started later and was realized earlier because they were very fast in Rotterdam. And they took these ideas from Delft, this differentiation, this layering of the communal space. And what they did there was a difference with Delft. I did not tell you that, but in Delft, they have these cluster spaces and group spaces are connected to certain private areas. And the idea is that, for instance, with children, it's easy that they are stay near the house, and eating together is pleasant near the house. And this is absolutely true, but there is another consideration, and they took that they worked with that in Rotterdam, and that is you can live together and be wonderful neighbors, but if you have different working hours and if you have different eating habits, it doesn't work. So they decided to have this differentiation of cluster space, but these cluster spaces should be reachable for everybody without having to put clothes and shoes on. And so everybody could reach cluster space, and people could organize themselves socially on their habits and working hours and having small children, yes or no, and eating habits. And of course, there are pros and cons of these two solutions, because when you have very small children, it's pleasant when they're in the playing space, is in the cluster space. But when you have teenagers, you are happy that there's a special cluster for teenager fun. And and of course there is another disadvantage in Rotterdam. You see the long, narrow corridors. It would be beautiful if they were broad and light, but that's always too expensive in social housing. So that's the price they pay. And this is one of the cluster spaces. It's to be considered, every project. I haven't got enough time to tell you about what.
Can I just say that clock is wrong?
Oh,
it's actually, it's 10 minutes to 12.
Okay.
But if you take 5 more minutes, then we have a little time for questions.
Okay, so I have 5 minutes and you have time for questions.
Yeah.
Okay. Now I come back to where I should be now, and I get there happily. And that is, what about group dynamics during this design period? Well, the enabler has to, it's quite clear that at this time there is a lot to be done. juridical, building committees, preparation for designing the communal garden, juridical things. It is important to form subgroups or what you call working groups, and let them do so people can be prepared and get to know that if you want to live communally, there is always something that has to be done, and that you always have to find people who are really doing it, but preferably with pleasure and commitment. The commitment thing is also an important thing. How, if you are looking at how does it go with our members, because if you have noticed, I talk about a project that is developed with the participation of as many future residents as possible. There is another route, it's the core group route. It's also possible, has advantages and disadvantages, but I focused on the developing with many people. You have to make sure that the people are involved, and which means that you have, this is a sense of feeling. How about the numbers? Do you think about it? And I think that at that time that one of the working groups, one of the subgroups, has to develop this recruiting and selecting program, and recruiting and getting to know each other, and selecting also, which of course is a vice versa situation, selecting. Then it's important to talk about responsibilities, and then there's another word that people do not like to hear when they want to live in a co-housing project, and that's the word sanctions. Now, the important thing about sanctions is that there is a very good concept of John Seisel, an architect and sociologist, American, a book of the 70s. But he speaks about the concept behavioral setting. He says a house where people, this is a behavioral setting, not a building, he would say. And a behavioral setting is a mix of spatial, morphological, administrative aspects, and the people who use it and the people who work there. That is a behavioral setting. And and everybody knows that if you want to run a situation, you need some kind of administration. And there is also the difference between formal administration and informal administration. Now, everything works much better if the informal administration does the work. But when does the job? But when does the informal administration work? If people have internalized the rules. So when you have internalized the rules that you have created and accepted together, there will something happen when something, do you call trespasses the rules or something? When children play on the jumping instrument until 8 o'clock, and every time another resident passes it at 9 or 10, and children are jumping and he doesn't say something about it, you are weakening this informal administrative, this informal administration effects. That's very important, but of course you also need formal administration, formal rules. So that is one of the things I also said. Don't forget to think about house rules, not just a statute, about smoking, about animals, about opening of the bar during the week, about and so on, lots of things that are important for you. And it's very often happened that people say we will do that when we really live together. It's an enormous drawback if you do it like that you start developing rules. You can do that beforehand. So making one of these things that, for instance, Philip Krabbendam and me, the architect and the social enabler, always say, is make the social process during the whole development and the development, the design and the building, make it mutual reinforcing, connected, and work together. So this is, and well, the threats, I think I have, there are threats. You want to hear a little bit about threats? Be careful. I told one, so wait until we really live together to find house rules, and underestimating the administrative complexity and the demands. Be careful in the time that the design program is still in operation, that a new generation of what is it called? New members? Prospective, yeah, new members, that they do not demand that the whole process will be reiterated, because they want also to find themselves back in the program. Just say no and say, develop your own project. Good luck. Good luck. And that's what it's really more or less about. And I would like to finish here and hope that I have made it a little bit clear that social enabling and leaving that to someone outside of the group, so you do not have to do the tricky work, is rather important, and also that there's a good relationship between the social enabling and the design process. So I wish you all the luck, and I hope I have given you some ideas for co-housing.
Thank you. Shall we take a few minutes for questions? Maria.
Maria Brenton, ouch, social enabler. I've just discovered my new title.
Yes, me too.
Could you say something just very briefly about the infrastructure of support in the system in Holland, like local authorities,
yes,
housing associations, that kind of thing?
Yes. Well, in the 70s and 80s, progressive housing corporations would very much like to have one project, so to prove that they were doing it. On the level of the local politicians, it's a very personal thing, and here the verbally very strong people and pay, also of course, yeah, practical, pleasant. But I did some research in several housing projects in Austria and in Holland, and there always is some kind of resentment against what in Austria they call an Altman, which we all think it's too Rudy, and there should be a statue for Rudy. And Rudy, and there is an element of resentment in, and I think that people can better accept architectural expertise than so-called social expertise. Social expertise is tricky material because, especially elderly people, I know that when you come there and you say, well, I have done some elderly co-housing projects as well, and it took really some time before they accepted me, but they also invited me. But in the beginning, they really said that you're not going to tell me how we are going to do that. Completely surprised. So you need professionality, and a professional shouldn't get burned out. Mm. Yes, because she's in a totally different situation and is not always burdened with the feeling, oh, but I also have to live with all these people instead. Yeah.
So I take ownership of Birmingham. I'm really interested in this exposition, the role of the social enabler in the project. We focus mainly on helping with group formation, taking responsibility for the development and making things work within the development. I don't know whether you could comment on the achievements of Dutch co-housing in relation to social mix and
yes.
wider society.
To mix, you mean the heterogeneity of the group, yeah, exactly. Economically, culturally. Well, that's in, of course it's in the paper, and I skipped it. It's very important, and I think many projects struggle with their ideals, that they want to have be as heterogeneous as possible, as representative as possible for their social cultural surroundings. And but they have become a little bit more well realistic, and they found out that a certain similarity of in culture especially, and lifestyle is, well, as I say, makes co-housing easier. And there's nothing more than this to say. Recently, in this Hilversum project, they have extra room for guests, but also they can use it for people in trouble. And they thought about taking all the people that come from Syria, refugees. Yes, and they said, shouldn't we do this? We have 2 apartments already, and you just stay in your own house for a while. And it made an enormous fuss in the project. And then who started to give this idea was quite overwhelmed by the emotions, even in the co-housing project. So, and there are all kinds of themes like that. So, many projects in the beginning started, and of course, we can also accommodate when it all works. Maybe people who are extra psychiatric patients, so they can have this period of. They have become, most projects, I must say, this is what I meant by pragmatic in the beginning, have become pragmatic and having these high hopes about themselves anymore.
Okay, two more questions. One here and then right here. I say who you are.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you. I'm interested in how the access or security of the project is enabled to like anyone entering site housing to eat maybe or share from the community neighborhoods, or are there any regulations about the access, or is there any borders like with plans or like fences or some sort of security system?
Oh, yeah.
Either people themselves spontaneously can establish some sort of solidarity in order to enable security, or more professional type of security like CCTV cameras or anything. Oh.
Well, of course, this is the theme of access. And most of these projects are developed in a relatively normal neighborhood in central cities or in new areas where new houses are built. So I am convinced. What I see is that they have no extra security measures, the same as family houses and. But I must admit, and it is a funny thing in Delft, that once they have, unhappily I have no time for access, and of course it is an important thing, but in one of these clusters, you can, yes, there's a small hall, that we call a hall between the front door and then the second door that goes to the cluster. Yes, and then it was quite easy to come in, but it's everywhere. So they have sometimes found someone sitting in the cluster or someone sitting in the group kitchen. And what's happening in the project with a cluster being 30 persons, when you pass such a person, you think, oh, no, probably it's here for him or for her or maybe for her. And they have to make some changes in the difficulty of entering the project. But nothing special happened. They found it rather funny. But it is important that, and certainly in the middle of the city, they have it's the same as the mansions and but I never heard about fences. No.
Or some sort of preventive mechanism.
No. Not that I know of, but I know. I mean, this of go.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I wonder why these more the mainstream ideas working together between communities and also today, we all so much of this stuff. Why couldn't this be a more common solution, like this partnership between the housing association and
Yes. Well, in the first, one of the reasons why not all architects want to develop a co-housing project is that it is much more money, hours for the same amount of money. And this goes also for corporations. If you have a co-housing project in your that takes much more time because co-housing people are nice, but also annoying because they are demanding things, they are expecting things. And it is true that not all corporations, only the relatively liberal corporations want to do it, but I have the feeling it hasn't become much easier now. And why that is we are now doing quite other things like some of the people here. We are there's being there will be a corporation especially for co-housing and communal housing projects because working with the corporation is an unsure thing. And there are other difficulties in the regulations. For instance, in former days, the idea of your lifestyle fits, but your income is too high, that you had to live in social housing situation. There were solutions for that in former years, in the day. But now they are quite strict. So I can't say it has become easier, and that's my opinion for now. Yeah. But there are different solutions, and I believe in different solutions. They are very active.
Thank you. Let's take a break now. We'll come back in 20 minutes. So,
may choose that they want to organise themselves. In terms of this, I think that there's a range of providers out there. What we've tended to do is be quite grassroots. So that the lenders at the moment are primarily the charity banks that Julius was mentioned earlier, and Charity Bank, etc., with the specialists in Ecology Building Society who understand more about what co-housing is. However, it's starting to diversify, and what we're seeing now is some groups looking at more social investment and actually moving to peer-to-peer lending as well, which I think is a really interesting development. And we're also seeing some interest from pension funds as well, like, both in co-housing but also in wider housing market too. I've got some other bits about the breakdown of elements, but I think I want to introduce some of the others into the team. My background is in the field of housing association, both in terms of housing association development and finance, and also local government and HCA finance. And I can bring some of that into that, and also explain maybe some of the structures on affordable housing, if that's of interest. I don't have it all, and I'd quite like to sort of pass over to some of my colleagues who've got different amounts of experience. To start in terms of your experience in terms of groups.
Okay. So you know I'm Andrea, and you know that I'm doing a PhD, and one of the chapters in my PhD is about the economics, so the economic distinctions between the different communities that I went to see. So that's one of my interests. But I'm also part of a group I'm a project manager by background, and I'm part of two groups that are forming in Brighton, where I live. One is calls itself a co-housing group, and is quite a large group, 20 to 30 people, or the core group of 8, who are trying to, exactly as you say, not be simply a private ownership model, although many of their members are homeowners, many of them are older homeowners, but to develop a neutral home ownership model. And I'm also part of an extremely tiny housing co-op who are self-building their own homes, and they are low-income, self-employed families who are not needy enough to get social housing from the council, but are not affluent enough to ever get out of the private rented sector, probably in their whole life. And they've got little kids, so they're self-building their home. And the reason why I bring them is because they present an interesting case study of the problems of being tiny. And in Brighton, you have a very inflated house market, like we have in London. And so the only land that's coming up are tiny plots for groups like this. So that's my experience, is that you've got this kind of difficult dynamic where the only plots that the local authority won't develop on, ones that are too small that are viable for them because they tend to have that big machinery to build, and private developers aren't there praying over them. So small plots, in a sense, I think might be the future for some of these low-income groups to get a purchase in housing. But
When you say tiny, how many households?
like two 3-bedroom properties. But what they're working on is just for 2 households, 2 3-bedroom properties, and you just use garage sale. They have nearly got money, but they are on the brink of getting agreement with principal. But what they have to do, I mean, is this too much detail around this topic? I'm not sure. I mean, I can talk in more detail about the dilemmas, but the dilemma broadly is that if the only land available to groups is small, and groups are small, and the finance people say you're too small for us to be of interest. That's one of my real life dilemmas that I'm working with.
Martin.
Like I said earlier, Martin Field University in Northampton have been involved in collaborative housing projects of one kind or another. Quite some years working with co-ops and social groups and co-housing in Brighton, working across the housing sector in the public sector and the housing association world, and with investment managers at housing corporation, like that. And I suppose what I'd say about finance, at short notice, is about how groups really do have to apply a business planning approach to it. And increasingly, even if groups may have felt in the past that their ideals and aspirations were well meaning enough in themselves to be seen as a suitable type of charitable purpose, increasingly it's unlikely that people would give them financial support just on the basis of that. And what needs to be put together is something that is very coherent and well established in recognising how the development aspect, development period of the scheme is going to be funded, and then what could take the place of long-term and loan finance thereafter. And that can be a model that is not predicated on any kind of individual tenure and can clearly include people who might have an individual ownership equity in some of the properties and people who have got a rental schedule. But the decisions made by groups at all stages will affect the ultimate costs of the schemes. And in part of my spare time, I've been trying to put together a small paper that looks at what's making co-housing expensive at the moment in the UK. It's clearly, unfortunately, it is expensive. That's not to say it has to be expensive, but what's been happening, you can look at individual schemes and try and get some of the background information about them and see where decisions led to some of the costs and some of the outcomes being what they are. I do think co-housing can be cross-tenure, but I think that aspiration and that idea needs to be very firmly embedded in the business plan to make it clear how a group of a complex variety of households imagines that the costs at the end of the day will be met from a range of different contributions from the household. It needs to be spelled out. And yes, I do think there's a role for peer-to-peer funding, but again, it's looking at where peer-to-peer funding can cover the developmental aspect and where it may be replaced long-term by the loan funding. So it's not a shaky funding when the peers want to seeing things in stages as part of that campaign.
Is that a challenge for groups to be able to put together that kind of robust financial and business plan?
I think it is, because there's few groups that automatically have members with that familiarity and that confidence. I think what it means is to recognise that that's part of their own capacity, and then they're looking for somebody externally known to us and support, but they recognise the financial level of
That is something that we're looking to do as part of the network, is actually bring both the experience of existing groups together of how they've actually done that, but also show those elements. And I've just scribbled down the basic elements of, finance, just right from the start, feasibility, how do you finance the social enablers, that side of things. Buying land, that's a whole art in itself. You've got then the development phase, that's another very technical process. You've got the long-term ownership and how that's financed. And you've also got the long-term maintenance as well to factor in. So all of these elements are things that people are experienced out there. Certainly in terms of my experience in housing association development, this is what is sort of drilled into you. You go through these various elements and they are separate financial elements and specialities. So it's actually enabling groups to see that big picture, so that some of the decisions that they make at the early stage might affect some of those later stages.
Right, well, I've been working for the last few years looking at some community organisations bringing empty properties into use. And interestingly, they adopted that label, like we talked about the self-help label. Sorry, yes, of course, yeah. Self-help housing, so bringing empty properties into use, and was really interested at the start of research, about 6 years ago, as to what were the main barriers that were standing between community-based organisations who actually wanted to do this, and the 200,000 or so empty properties that exist across the country, long-term rentals. And not surprisingly, there were a number of barriers, but the money to actually refurbish the properties to the point at which people could live in them was probably the main barrier, because once you could actually do that work, you could then sustain the project from the rental income in terms of usual housing management and so on. So we found out what would happen when that barrier was removed, when remarkably the coalition government provided some grant funding precisely for this. So there was £50 million, and there was over 100 projects across the country who got involved in this work, a number of whom hadn't been doing this kind of thing before. So you could see the difference that kind of funding made. But of course, like all government-funded initiatives, the tap gets turned off as well as on. So the last 2 years, we've really been in the phase of what happens to replace or substitute for that funding. And this is where we've had one of those encounters between the kind of grassroots sector and finance industry, social investors, commercial lenders, etc., and just seeing what really might happen. One of the things that happened was that the government grant during the 5 years of the programme appeared to be really important to the financial investors in terms of mitigating their risk and actually taking. We have a wonderful picture of a cocktail glass showing what kind of funding you need to get a housing project going. You basically got different colours liquid in the glass, but what the social investors seem to be saying is that if you didn't have some form of subsidy for this kind of activity at the bottom, then they will be much less interested in lending. So that's one. I don't know anything about money, by the way, so I wouldn't want to ask to contribute to this session. I think I don't. These are just some of the things I've learned from that process. So it's really this idea of the cocktail funding, the first one. The 100 or so groups were pretty successful in levering in other sources of money against the income stream they got from renting properties out, and in some cases from actually having an asset to borrow against. One of the interesting things there, when they had an asset, was should they go to a social investor? Should they go to somebody like, so I think we may be using social investment slightly differently, but I'm calling like Tridos, Charity Bank, Ecology Building Society, Big Issue Invest. These organisations that pitch their investment as having a social purpose. And a number of the groups were finding that there were no real advantage in going to the social investors as opposed to the local branch of their bank where they've been keeping their accounts for a period. This was where they had the property asset because the lender was secured against the asset value of the property. The social investors were generally in slightly more risky territory. They weren't, it was much more logical to go to the social investors when you didn't have the asset security and you were being charged obviously higher interest rates as a result of that. Just had an interesting discussion, this is my final nugget, I've got very few, but the interesting discussion last week at an event where one of the things that the groups are trying to get now are asset transfers. So they're trying to get the local authorities and other property owners who have housing assets that are not really much use to them. You might call it liability transfers, so it's the other side. But local authorities have actually gifted a number of properties to community-based housing organisations, usually for £1 or something like that. And then we heard, I think it was the Ecology Building Society, but we heard that this isn't always that satisfactory from the investor's point of view either, because they don't really like the documentation that local authorities issue against these gifted properties, but it doesn't necessarily provide the security that they're looking for. So there's a new little area of activity going on at the moment of trying to get documentation when local authorities are giving away the properties, but they're not giving away adequate documents from the funder's point of view, but to actually improve the documents so that the lenders are more comfortable about the security of the assets and therefore able to boost the activity in the group. So I think risk finance, project finance, and the benefits of asset ownership, but the limits to legal to a non-financially literate researcher.
It's also you mean by documents that they won't have to read.
Okay, so ex-city council says you can have the use of this property. Sometimes they limit it to say a 99 year lease or a number of years than that. But sometimes it appeared to be an asset transfer, and it looked from the research that it was an asset transfer. But from the point of view of the building society, the bank, when they came to be asked to lend against it, they said we're not happy that the title is sufficient to cover our risk. I guess so. I guess so. It was unclear to the. I think it was clear to the local authority and to the group, but it wasn't clear to the
A different threshold is
probably.
ownership.
Yeah.
Would it be useful if I chipped in a bit about affordable housing and that building, working with housing associations?
Yes, this country are one of the main backers of this music.
I think a really important starting point is that housing associations are predominantly do their development through private finance. So sat behind the housing associations are their lenders. So exactly the same thing that David's talked about risk and risk profile. If you were going to a lender, sat behind the housing association. They have all sorts of covenants and issues with their loans that they need to watch, and they watch them really carefully because they're millions, if not billions of pounds. And a lot of their decisions, although they may have philanthropic motivations, a lot of their decisions may come across as very risk averse because of those lender drivers. In effect, the way that they are currently developing is mostly now with very little government grant support. So what they are doing is actually the vast majority of the funding is in effect a bit like a mortgage. So they're borrowing and then they're repaying that on the rent profile. And whilst that is actually done right across an organisation, when you're working out an individual housing development scheme, you're doing it property by property. property. So you're actually looking at what rental income you can get from a property, and therefore what loan rate that will actually support. And what usually happens is there's usually a gap between how much development costs and how much the rent that you can support. So that's the bit that's tended to be grant funded. Or it could be, as you're seeing more and more, is shared ownership funded. So you're actually getting an element where somebody's buying it. And sometimes it is actually subsidised through the development process, through the actual land. You might have heard something called a Section 106 agreement, where a developer has to provide a certain element of the housing as affordable housing. And this can be relevant to co-housing groups as well, because they may be given a Section 106 requirement to provide a certain amount of affordable housing, not realising that actually there is a subsidy built into that system that requires an element to use the land. And I think that's quite useful information for groups to understand, particularly in terms of cultural fit and organisations working alongside each other to actually from the outset understand those parameters and those limitations that housing associations might come across as looking as quite rich organisations, but they have very tight parameters that they have to work to, and how those might work with the groups as well. But I think it's entirely possible for that to work effectively if you've got a good cultural fit. And housing associations are very skilled with things like project management skills, or technical project management skills, that might be things that actually groups need to guide them through the process. But it's a mixed bag out there, and it's very local as well. And that's what we're learning all the time, that what might work in one area doesn't necessarily work in another area.
I'd be interested to hear later about some people's experience working with housing associations, because they're experiencing that too. But hearing about how housing associations work through the numbers and see what's feasible brings us back to the question of why is co-housing is much more expensive than the same number of units of their standard developments. What have you found, Martin? Why is it more expensive?
It's difficult to generalise, but I think it's to do with, this is to do with finance, but I think it's to do with the way we approach property development in this country. We approach property development as something that's going to create value that can then be redeemed on the mortgage market, redeemed by house sales or house prices. And there's a thriving culture about building new property and having it done as much as an effective use can be done to it. But what that tends to do is always to be looking at valuing things as high as possible. And in a community-led housing sector, that can lead to people having to pay mortgage rates for everything, so open market rates for everything, instead of trying to keep the cost down to cost level rather than value. So what I see in some projects is them automatically looking at maximising the values of the properties to try and maximise the income coming in, and thereby squeezing out some of the lower income potential members of the scheme and ending up with an ever increasingly high value scheme, rather than trying to work to a business plan that's going to keep the cost to a minimum and only work to the cost. And if there is a value over and above the cost, to keep it as a value in the project, rather than asking members automatically to pay for it. So I think it's to do with the expertise that tends to look at co-housing and other collaborative housing schemes as property development, because you think it's got property development element in the development lifetime. And that's what needs to be cut through. Yeah.
So it's the intersection of two mindsets.
That's where I got to admit. I might be in a very idiosyncratic reading. That's what I think.
It'd be quite useful to kind of throw this open a bit, to have other people's contributions, if that's
shared ownership can be thing for you because then it's potentially not the right to buy 100% as well as self-dependent the right to buy the core model. And the other question is, so my question is to you, what can be done about that? Second question is about community campus. Do you think community campus can unlock some more charitable trust, like with funding rather than lending? Because it's a charitable cause.
I think one of the things about community land trusts is if they're done by local community for local community benefit, affordable housing benefit, there's certainly a possibility that some of the costs could be reduced by other philanthropic support, like local site owners being prepared to lease their sites at minimal cost if they know it's going to be remaining in community benefit. So for the sake of an affordable housing element in a community-led scheme, you could benefit from that degree of wider support for that element of the scheme that might have a community land trust approach to it. If you're trying to integrate that outcome of affordable housing into another wider approach that might involve other teams, then you've got to think about a bit more juggling. It's not impossible to do that, but you're talking almost about trying to have a mind focused on different elements of your scheme that go together as the financial whole.
And that's working for diversity,
yeah.
You just have one model for different kind of things as well as
I think it's going to be difficult to get things at reduced prices if it's for outright ownership. Anything like outright ownership, 99% equity, 99, it's good for one where there's a community benefit that otherwise support.
If we go back to the sort of garden cities one here, you're very interesting, Martin, is if the owner of the overall development is the community benefit organisation, can you not then have the commercial activity under that umbrella? But I'm not quite sure I haven't fully thought this through, but it seems to me that if you take like East London Community Land Trust, the Community Land Trust is the community bit within a wider development. And the ideal, I would have thought, would be of a wider development with community land trust, and you don't have the commercial activity within it, but you've got more possibility of control of it. Is that not possible? First you get the land, isn't it? You get the land.
What I say about the inquiry about shared ownership is, yes, there's as I understand it, there may be an opportunity for people to staircase additional purchase and equity in later life if it's got some element of public finance. If you set up a shared ownership tenure as a privately commissioned scheme, my understanding would be you could set what limits you wanted to of what ceiling people could purchase to.
Only if you use a homes and communities agency lease and it's got public subsidy into it. Yeah. But years ago I used to do shared ownership for rural housing, and that was done on a non-subsidised basis. In terms of a non-public subsidy cash basis, how it was subsidised is through the land was at a very low price because it was specifically for affordable housing. So that's where you can replicate like the CLT model coming in, and then you actually do a non-public subsidy version of shared ownership. And it's something that that the network, the Cohousing network, is currently working on with the Community Land Trust Network and with CDS cooperatives, actually looking at these finance models. So instead of saying we're all separate entities, which we are, but actually there's a lot of commonality in our work, and actually sharing that information so that then groups easily have access to that information rather than each group having to find it out themselves. So that's something we're currently working on at the moment to share later in the year.
Yeah, there's a couple of points coming back to some things that were said in the last minutes. One talking about, well, we have this kind of enabler or moderator or facilitator, and it seems that we have an initial understanding that this person is going communications and decision making. I can say from what we know from the London Building, as part of this package, it's usually included financing, so it's not a separate person. And I think it's generally for the sake of efficiency of the development process. So we use the word steering or insurance. This person or this team has the responsibility of the challenge of commodity decisions, but also to pay attention to finance. And in fact, there are quite strong links that should be in those. So it's really quite helpful to have the same group. Another point was looking at self-help. This is Berlin from some years ago when we had a lot of vacant buildings, but the city of Berlin put a lot of money into the self-help programs, helping people that were in old abandoned buildings. And it wasn't just to create the affordable housing, but to maintain or secure affordable housing for the people in buildings where they were, but other part of the job training. So again, there really a important synergy which worked in Berlin for a 20 period at least, so everyone was absolutely 2000. It is the only project I'm supporting that, and it's fantastic. And when people thought about alternative policy, in those years, that's what came to mind. Oh yeah, these people are renovating the old buildings, and some systems, especially in an area like Berlin was, it has decreased in population, decrease in economy, and it's
In the last few minutes here, can we ask if anybody wants to share the experience they have had, either successfully or unsuccessfully, trying to secure finance or working with developers?
Yeah, so my name is James Newton. I'm from Your Space Cohousing in New York. Our experience with trying to access finance for our land was that we had a lender that was willing to lend to us, but we had to raise 30%, and when our development costs were at £1.8 million, it was getting to £500,000 we had to generate, and the way we were going to do that was through sort of crowdfunding and becoming a community benefit society. I think if the co-housing network was a vehicle and a conduit to help promote those schemes, there are people that want to invest in that type of development. We had £130,000 of pledges of investment just in the local community. We didn't get national on that. So I think there are opportunities, but that's because they were investing in our model, which was a mutual home ownership model where we weren't going to sell our houses on the open market, or people didn't have the opportunity to do that if they wanted to leave. So I think looking at that kind of model starts to open up doors for people to invest, because people know that it's for the benefit. Because those houses will stay affordable in perpetuity. People like that idea. And very quickly to go back on the reason why things cost more, our model is actually costing less, but I think another issue is density, because you're not a housing provider or a house builder that's just building tiny houses and loads of them next to each other. There's community shared space between. There's a common house particularly as well. So there's those aspects that need to be factored into what things are more expensive in a co-housing model.
Can I ask these, the investment that we did generate from people locally, did they expect a return on that?
Yeah, we weren't offering a lot. Over 5 years, we were offering 2%, maybe 10 years, we were offering 3%. So we were offering them bonds within our company. So yeah, and there was quite a lot of interest. Predominantly, people were going for the 5-year option. I know that Chaco Cohousing just put an offer out on there. Yeah. I think it's something that people should consider, because I think we were offering 6% for a loan from the bank, so just kind of half that, isn't it? Yeah.
I just wanted to raise you, what point in the development, taking on what the subject material that Alice taught earlier, group building, what point should a group know what it's going to cost? To give you a case example, I just quit the group in North London, which I've been working my socks off on for 5 years. And the developer, Housing Association, has been unable or unwilling to give us any kind of cost all the way through. They gave us a kind of benchmark cost at the beginning of 2015, and by 2016 it had gone up by 35%. So how do you develop a group in tandem with that development process when, as what happened with ours, in a matter of weeks, 19 households went down to 5 because they could no longer afford it. And they put 5 years' worth of work in to no avail because the developer either couldn't or wouldn't tell them what costs they were anticipating.
Young than Andrea.
Yeah, and it's probably a dialogue to the panel, but just speaking as an architect and someone who was involved in doing public developments earlier on and has been keeping up with the contract situation, a lot of this depends on the type of contract that you're working with and the type of contract that the developer's working with. So if you're working with a design and build contract, then the developer has a lot more control over what they're going to tell you. Whereas if you work with a JCT contract or other forms of contract where you build in the requirement to have particular types of costs given, then actually the client is a little bit more in the control seat. Joint contracts tribunal, it's a different thing of contract, but I mean things have changed a lot over the last few decades, and design and build is much more common now. But I do think, I think for the co-housing generally, it's really important to fight for the right type of contract with both the contractor and the developer, and to set up those agreements in advance.
I think that is kind of, a really, the partnership working agenda is really important. It's really important about, the co-design of the process for co-housing and for groups to actually have their ownership of that process, and actually right at the start, those terms and conditions need to be drawn up and, even need to be, to a certain extent, legally binding when you're actually entering a partnership
The partner with power won't sign a legal agreement with you, which is what was the
I
case.
walk away.
Well, we had.
Yeah.
It took 5 years of work.
But they're landowners as well, so were they the landowner?
They bought the land that we told them was available.
Yeah. Andrea, I'll let you have the last word.
It's only to repeat exactly what Phil said, is you should, even small groups I've worked with know that you end your business case, you don't have a group until you know the finances. You don't have a group until you've got the bottom line and you forecast your business case, the scheme.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you so much to everyone sitting at the top end of the table who didn't know until about 15 minutes ago that they would be doing this, but that's been fantastically useful to have all these points of view and spend the rest of the afternoon talking about it. Thank you again. 3 minutes to top up your teas and fun. Welcome next panel.
And it was an amazing catalyst. So we can forgive the planners, we can forgive everything. It brought the group together in a really remarkable way. And one of the things I want to talk about in terms of the opportunities, harking back to what Anna Dijkhuis had to say earlier, and also the mentions of social architecture. In the forthcoming months, there's going to be a huge lot of attention on the physical architecture. People are going to come and look at this lovely building that Patrick designed and blah, blah, blah. And I'm going to be saying, but what makes the difference between, this could be a really nice, modern, purpose-built sheltered housing scheme. What's the difference? And the difference is the social capital that has been built within it. So the real opportunities, I'm talking about senior co-housing mostly, is to preserve autonomy. And that's something that is not of a high value in our society for older people, if they're noticed at all. For older people to say, absolutely in charge of their own lives. But what have we got? We've got a housing market of, a crazy housing market, of volume builders who build what they want and then inflict that on a rather undiscerning elderly population who have to buy what there is.
McCarthy and Stone, whom I often meet on the housing circuits, have said to me, believe us, if there was something that older people wanted, McCarthy and Stone would have delivered it already. There's also the issue of, vis-a-vis McCarthy and Stone, they're a good case in point. A research study on them a few years ago found that in 60% of their planning applications to local authorities, they had to go to appeal. 60%. Now, in my view, that's pure naked ageism on the part of local authorities, thus keeping their heads well in the sand against the inevitable ageing of our society and their own ageing. But they do not welcome older people's developments within their boundaries on the whole. So when we went to Barnet, we were opposed initially for the first 2 years because older people would make demands on their health and social care services. And they already felt that they had the highest proportion of older people of any borough in London, which I think at the time was 9%. Down in the West Country, it's 30, going up to 50. Anyway, we got over that, but with eventually persuading them that there was a sort of cost benefit to this development, and they were not going to be extra demands on their health and social care services. I was having a very interesting talk with Charlie earlier about this, about social impact evaluation. We are so short-sighted in this country. Local authorities have to sell land for top buck. Everybody sells it for top buck because we have so commodified housing in our society. And the costs down the line of not having the right housing are totally unaccounted for. So in terms of old age, the costs down the line of 60% of older women over 75 living alone, 34% of older men over 75 living alone, with the concomitant effects for some, for many, of loneliness and isolation, self-neglect, health problems developing. There's loads of research to indicate the impact of that. The costs on a creaking health service, which people are now complaining about, and bed blockers, we could have stopped some of that down the line by encouraging the development of groups like Cohousing, where people could support each other and stay in charge of their own life. The issue of older people having more say as end users, as I think a very neglected area. I don't think there's a culture of end-use involvement or even care in our housing industry. Housing associations, the ones, the larger ones anyway, do have no concept of co-production. They have not the least bit of understanding of co-production. Smaller ones do. I think the ones that Anna worked for, Pastor was it at the time, they came to a very helpful relationship with Threshold. But the larger they get, the more bureaucratic they get, the more commercial and profit-oriented they get, the less they understand anything about forming an equal partnership with a group of interested, motivated older people. So in terms of the development of social capital, I just wanted to say a few words about what Ouch has done to develop its social capital. I have to come clean here. It's had a very, very long time to do it. When they move in August, I will have been working with them 18 years. Now, that's partly because they were born before their time, in the late 90s, when I came back from Holland, all fired up with this model that I'd investigated there. It's partly because there is a culture that doesn't really understand this at all. The group is mixed tenure. It's 26 people, women, 25 flats. 2/3 of them are being purchased. 1/3 is for social rental.
proper original social rental, not affordable. And we have only been able to finance that through getting a large grant from the Jubilee Trust, who despaired of us ever getting anywhere. And the group itself could not afford, being so small and low income really on the whole, to cross-finance the development of the social housing flats. They will be managed by a small housing association, Housing for Women, who has worked in partnership with us since 1998. So actually having to find a housing association developer because they were mixed rental, that was the message we were told in the year 2000 by the Housing Corporation. Conditions of any support from us is you must find a housing association developer. You must find a supported local authority. You must have a legal status. You must have a bank account, blah, blah, blah. And we set out looking for them. We have been through 8 to 10 housing associations in that time. Some of them worked with us for maybe 2 years and then lost interest. Others worked for 5 minutes, lost interest. Generally, not very interested. Hanover bought this site for us in 2010 and has developed it, bought it at risk and has developed it at risk. And for that, we are very, very grateful. They also financed our involvement with PTE. So up until about 2 years ago, the group had not had to put any money down. Frankly, I wish we had raised money because we would have had more clout, more say, and more power. It wasn't until the group put their deposits down that Hanover started even getting friendly. That's when its risk was mitigated. They had the deposits in the bank. So we have a group of older people who have built a group, the social cohesion around shared values, mutual support, and sense of belonging. Now, some of them brought skills from the feminist movement, others brought skills from running a family or running a profession or whatever, but they have a huge number of skills, which I have learned from myself over the years. They've got this kind of template, which is quite fixed now. A 2-hour business meeting once a month, always facilitated by somebody different. No idea how much that is an issue in some groups. I ask, who facilitates your co-housing group? And I get the answer, me, of course, it's my baby. There is a rotating facilitation role in the group, and it's formal. There's training in facilitation available, and it's important that meetings are well run because people get tired, and older people particularly get tired and fed up. The meal is central and always a colourful treat, and visitors and inquirers are invited to it, and they're then allocated a buddy who is their contact point with the group. The afternoons are often devoted to workshops, either run by trainers that we've hired, or by somebody from the group, or by me. And they've all resulted in the formulation of policies for living together. So over the years, they have worked on consensus decision-making, conflict resolution, defining mutual support, what it is, what it isn't, where does it end, very important, diversity and equal opportunities, and most lately, hidden bias. Frequently, there's also been fun games, dancing, singing, and all sorts of things, plus social outings arranged in between times. And the group has organized itself through a variety of task groups, such as overall coordination and strategy, which is an elected management group, communications, finance, legal issues, membership, equal ops, and more latterly, a common areas planning group, garden planning group, a relocation group, and they all report back to the main meeting. There's also a social group which organizes the outings. And the purpose of that is to decentralize the work of the group, to involve everybody who wants to be involved, some of them aren't or can't be, and also to give them the opportunity in between meetings of creating social bonds in smaller sort of numbers. Now, in terms of
You know how on the finance side, I think we were all innocents. We have been lucky. If I compare this experience, this project, which is going to be a plus, it's going to be wonderful, we're the first senior co-housing group in the country, compared with my own experience in North London, it's worked and that hasn't, so we know. Next slide. Oh, it's me, isn't it? Right. Did that do it? So here you have a very strong group, quite a sort of, you know,
Maria's got the controls.
Oh, right, yes.
You go back to
I'm on challenges, am I right? Okay.
Sorry.
What I would say without going on too much is that the major challenge in our society is the prevailing mindset and culture, which is so unfavourable to community-led initiatives in housing. And it is so short-sighted and blind. Looking at co-housing for older people, one of the first questions I was asked in Barnet was, okay, so you say it improves people's health and keeps them happier and whatnot. Prove it. End of story. Now, one of my questions to people who come from Holland and Germany, where you've had these things for 20, 30 years, where are the longitudinal studies that give me ammunition? You know, you've had all that time to compare the results, the outcomes of living in senior co-housing against studies of general living older people. And yet I can't find any. And we badly need this in this country because it adds up to pounds, shillings, and pence in local authority eyes. This will save us money, and you can prove it. So there's a great deal of distrust about this model, and we hope to be a group that dispels it. My main interest has been keeping them all alive until they move in. I can't tell you how many times, two of us have been on the project board with the developer, construction firm, the employer's agent, blah, blah, blah. Had to learn a whole new language. And over 5 years, we've constantly been saying, could you get more urgent? We're getting old. And I don't know how anything's built in this country. It was, oh, well, next month will do, and the next month after that will do, and then, oh, we've changed our minds on that, so we're going to another tack. And I can't believe it. While our group got older and older, 2 have died in the process, 1 has developed dementia and had to leave, but for the most part, we're pretty good.
Please can we say that so don't get the idea they're all my age.
50 to 87, and that range is deliberate. So the people we're taking in at the moment are in their 50s, so that the group stays dynamic, even though the people in their 80s in the group are the most active and lively in the whole darn group. But in terms of image and presentation to recruits coming on, it's important. And the group is developing a sort of hinterland of women who will be hopefully integrated into the group, the life of the group without living there, and be ready to step into vacancies as they occur. So mindset and culture, I've been attacking it for 20 years in this country. I think we have made quite a lot of inroads in the sense that co-housing and senior co-housing, the brand name has become much more recognized. And over the last 2 years, I cannot count the number of older people who come through our website saying, I just Googled co-housing and I found you, when can I come, where can I join? There is a huge amount of demand out there. We had a blitz on publicity with the BBC in February. I am dealing with the 100 or so women who came looking for the 2 flats that were still available. And saying to them, well, okay, you might have to do your own group, but I know how difficult it is, especially in London. So What are the game changers? Are we on that? We desperately need a positive housing policy that looks at all the costs and all the costs down the line and makes the right conclusions. Selling land to the highest bidder is such a false economy. I came across groups in Holland where the local council had let them have at below market value an old school or an old this or an old that, and they were developing it. And the local authorities saw it as an investment. I talked to a housing association developer and I said, look, I look at your literature and you don't appear to be applying your rules about eligibility and income levels. And he said, old people's projects are such a great investment and they are such a good investment for the local area that they happen to drop in. Why let rules get in the way? And I mean, would you ever get that kind of reaction here? I doubt it. So we need a holistic approach to all the costs around an aging society that will make giving land away seem relatively cheap when you factor in all the billions that are being spent on rather inadequate care. We need to encourage retrofit co-housing because getting land is very difficult, and retrofit is what the co-housing network will be turning its attention to. There's two ways you can understand retrofit. One is you rehabilitate an old building and refurb it, and two is you refurb some people. I came across a mention of a group in Rijswijk in Holland where older people had been living in this block of rented accommodation for years. Their housing association encouraged them to become a living group, co-housing, kept a flat empty, and I assume did some community development with them to get them to do more than say good morning to each other. So retrofitting a group without having to move is another model. But in Holland, you've got the example of models within an hour away, where you can go and talk to people who are living it, and you can learn lessons from them. In this country, there's nothing to look at. Local authority departments talking to each other would be a great advantage in relation to co-housing. I won't dwell on that because it affects so many areas of life. But local authorities need to get into this game. And then in terms of the groups themselves, I believe that groups would get going much more successfully and sustain themselves if there were seed corn funding that wasn't tied to impossible rules, like, I don't know, having a neighbourhood referendum, or like spending it by yesterday because it's only available until tomorrow, that kind of bureaucratic constriction. I came across in Holland the possibility where you could get a provincial grant for private commissioning of building, which was actually primarily to encourage small builders, to encourage variety in the development of housing in Holland against the horrible uniformity of the volume builders. But it also made grants available to small groups, co-housing groups, who could have a grant, one tranche of it to hire a project manager to get them up to speed on a business plan and to look at the finance. When they delivered that, they got another tranche of money to deliver another outcome, and then there was a third tranche to deliver a final outcome. That kind of seed money, not terribly expensive, is missing for the most part in this country. Where it becomes available, it's got so many bureaucratic restrictions on it that nobody wants to touch it. So that's really all I'd say about my game changers.
Thank you. Tom, can I ask you to tell us a little bit about what
Sure.
you're involved in?
I have a presentation as well, so it's quite feedback is sound here.
Yeah.
I'll see, I'm streaming live. Just whilst you're waiting, I should give some credit to Maria and because about 4 or 5 years ago, when I was a student studying like into Maria. So she was actually part of the research project I did, and Anna put me up for 2 weeks when I was in Rotterdam, so she really helped me out as well. It should be LRC presentation. Oh, okay, that's right. Great. Yes, it's PDF. Oh, okay. Okay, well, it's going to chop the top off, but right. So I'm just going to do a very brief overview of the research that I did between 2011 and about 2013. I'm just going to talk to you quickly about the context of the study, co-housing in 5 different countries, the findings of the study, and then further opportunities, which I guess are the kind of game changers. So about 4 or 5 years ago, I was awarded the RIBA Boyd August Scholarship, which was a travel bursary for architecture students. And this was to look at multi-generational senior co-housing. I visited 88 projects within the US, mainly in central US and the East Coast, because I felt that the West Coast had been better documented. Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, and the UK. And it's quite, when you're quite thrifty as a student, it's quite amazing how far it could go, because I was originally going to only visit about 25 projects, so it was really good. And people were really friendly in co-housing projects. They sometimes put me up as well in their guest rooms. So it was a really enjoyable experience, and to be honest, probably one of the best experiences I've had in my life, I think. So the objectives of the research were to look at the differences between co-housing projects within these countries, looking at the experiences of older people using co-housing, which is more about what my master's work during my design studio project was about. Does design make a difference? Looking at the best practice and what worked and didn't work. So I'll start with the United States. As we know, there's a higher dependency on the automobile, and this is quite a significant influence. There's a much lower density development density in the US, as you might expect. So some of the earlier projects, like in Pioneer Valley co-housing, it almost really still, you can see the American dream of having a big timber framed house and your own of an architecture style, and having a separate common house. You can see how it's kind of adapted to the American culture. It's mainly an adaptation of the Danish model. I think it's because it suits, it's kind of the closest one to the US culture, whereas Sweden and Netherlands are perhaps further along. It's generally more private ownership, although they do have some social housing as well. Some of the projects were quite remote, because obviously it's such a big country. And one of the interesting things is that a lot of the common houses that I visited, that Americans like to talk about their basements. I guess that's part of their property market. They're always wondering what the square foot of their basements is going to be. We're very proud to show you these spaces, but what we would normally consider like a storage space would often be used as half of the common room space. So it would actually be a space to be badly ventilated, artificially lit, no windows. So it wasn't actually somewhere that people would want to use. And I just thought that was really interesting, because loads of projects were like this. It's quite surprising. Okay, and so Denmark, it's more sort of medium density suburban housing. I didn't see very much city centre living, it was more suburban. Very high quality design and architectural innovation, as maybe is quite expected. Again, it's very much part of their culture. They have a good focus on architecture in Denmark. I was surprised to find that some of the older projects are still some of the most interesting. I think it's partly because of the architects at that time. They just seemed to really go for it, and there were some retrofit projects which were really interesting as well, and actually they created spaces that perhaps you wouldn't have originally designed, and they actually worked better perhaps than an intentional design. They had really good attention to small details, and I found that really interesting, because it just shows that there's little things that make a big difference in terms of how people interact and use their spaces. So there's one here where it's an internal street, and it's little things like the sound pit there, where the window's located. In fact, they have really big glass windows at the entrance to the buildings. Sorry, the entrance to the residential units. There's a mixture of private and state ownership, although so more private ownership in the Netherlands and Sweden. I already mentioned about retrofit projects. In the Netherlands, well, Anna's already given you a good introduction to the Dutch co-housing. It's primarily medium or high density social housing. There's one thing that really surprised me is that most of it is social housing. It's as common in Dutch culture, isn't it? It's a lot more people, it's much more normal to live in social housing.
Less and less.
Lessons. Oh, okay. Well, this is changing. Okay, so it is becoming more private, but it's still much higher than the UK. Also, a very high level of innovation and experimentation. I saw when I went around these projects, there was lots of these architecture models similar to what Anna had. Although the one that her friend Philippe designed was perhaps one of the most ambitious ones. Projects originally tend to be subdivided into clusters or smaller groups. So this is again what Anna was talking about. And I thought this was really interesting. So in most co-housing projects, you have your own individual kitchen, as you know, in your apartment, and then you have one for the whole group. Whereas in Dutch co-housing or central wonen, it's very common to have this sort of, it's like a middle hierarchy of communal space, which is shared between 10, 12 units. It's more like a cluster. And what I found interesting is a lot of these projects were built in the 70s. And when I visited them, these spaces were no longer used as kitchens in many examples. If they build them, they still use those, but it's very rare for these kitchens to be used as kind of middle level ones. So that, I think, it's a sign that maybe it didn't work so well. And maybe it's just having a flatter hierarchy in the level of common spaces. It maybe works better. There's also a very high number of wonen groups, which is like senior co-housing. These don't always have a kitchen. These don't always have their own kitchen for the whole group, but some of them do. It's much more common, as Maria was talking about. And they also have very, very generous common spaces, some of them. I think it surprised me. Like, some of them had so much common space that a lot of it wasn't actually utilised properly. So it's almost like, I was surprised to find it, but actually some of them had too much common space. And they were using it for things like clothing storage, where they could come up and use clothes. So, you know, they had a Dutch word for it, like a jungle sale. There was a word for it where it was like reusing old clothes.
Yes.
They all had this in them, and I thought, God, it's a really bad use of space. Well, see, it's a good use of space, but it's just the fact that that space wasn't used very well. If you compare it to a space where people are socialising, there should be people be in that space every day. This was a space that a person might go in once a week, or that, you know, one person out of the whole community. So I didn't feel it wasn't working hard, the space.
You have to be a bit careful, actually, because I mean, it's an architect's disease to always see storage space as something that's less useful than socialising space. And actually, most of our housing has too little storage space. And actually, in that sense, the Dutch schemes are much, much more resilient than our space.
Yes, you're quite right. But one thing I would say is that within the apartments, they also did have storage. So it's like they did have their own storage, and they had not basements, but they did have, a lot of them had storage space as well. But it's almost like there's this additional. I think the reason for some of that additional space might have been because they lost that middle hierarchy. They lost that middle level of community space, like the kitchens I told you about. Does that make sense?
Maybe.
Okay, cool.
I didn't come across any of that 20 years ago.
Oh, didn't? Okay.
No, but it might be the age and longevity of groups.
Yes.
They don't use their community facilities so intensively anymore.
Like I say, it was only that middle tier, so they would still use the big kitchen for the whole group, but they wouldn't use it would be less common for them to be using the cluster groups. And a lot of them said it's because it was too intense, you know, because it was a smaller group of people using those kitchens. But they didn't get on so well. But if it was more people using a kitchen, it worked okay.
The communal life is moving like this.
Exactly. So when they moved in, it was said that they had a lot more energy when they moved in. And then that energy kind of sort of dissipated a bit, yes. But although it still worked, projects still worked.
But there's a way that you can
Yes.
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 Good when you do that.
Yeah.
I went to visit Hilversum
Yes.
a few years ago, and an old bloke that I was visiting then said, well, my staircase, that arrangement doesn't work anymore because the kids only want to be with their parents and they say we never see you. And so people who weren't nuclear family got sort of crowded out in this hot using space
Well,
as the kids grew.
I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute in terms of adaptations of the architecture, but it was the same at the one that Anna's friend designed, the one that she showed, which is earlier on. And there it was all very open at the beginning, and some of them still were open, but a lot of them blocked off into separate accommodation units. That one was really sort of forward thinking because it tried to really break down the barriers. In the extent to in Nick's apartment, yes. So it's kind of, to imagine it, it would be like you having your sitting room and bedroom, and then you have a stairwell with there's no, I think there were no doors originally. Yeah, so there's no doors. So you'd have other people walking past your bedroom and your sitting room to the other units. But in each of these kind of stair calls, there would only be about 4 flats, 4 apartments, so that might be 6 apartments. So you have a limited number of people, but it's still kind of quite, it's really trying to push the model. I don't think many people got on with it, but I think because Flip was the designer, he wanted to keep it going, and try it out. Was that, do you follow it? Yes.
And at that time they wanted that, and it is you have a house, but that consists of private spaces.
Yes.
And you can rent as many spaces as you can afford and are available.
So it
So
had
it's completely different, and that's why they connect with this access structure.
So it's a very interesting project. It has many things that have changed, but some things remain the same. Oh, right, okay, really quick. Right, and also the other thing about the Dutch model is that because they were funded by housing associations, a lot of them had to build in adaptability. So if the co-housing model didn't work, if the social group didn't work, then they reverted to more housing. Sometimes this compromised the overall design. So the common room might not be in a particularly good place. And being Dutch, they have very big bike stalls. And one of the things I hadn't considered is they had very large buggy stalls. That's one thing that I hadn't actually considered. But some schemes have 20 of these buggies, some of the road routes. And then Sweden has the highest density of projects. I think these are actually quite different, and we can learn a lot of lessons from them. They have some very large group sizes. Trekanten was, I think, was about 200 units, which didn't work because it was too big. Lots of innovation in kitchen design, so we can learn a lot from that. It's primarily social housing, but that's because in Sweden social housing is fairly normal where lots of middle class people live in social housing. It shows that co-housing can work at very high densities. The Swedish have much more regular communal meals, so that whereas in other countries it's much more common to have 1 meal a week perhaps. Here they'd be having meals every working night. And laundry rooms are a big part of Swedish culture as well. So normal flats have these. And then in the UK, I feel that we're somewhere between the US and Scandinavia. So if either side can do it, then I'm sure that we can be just as good. Many are retrofits, as Maria was talking about. I think sometimes it doesn't always limit the architectural scope. Sometimes it can make it more interesting, but sometimes it can limit the adaptability of the architecture. So, for example, you might not have as much transparency into the common space. If it's a farmhouse with thick top walls. Sorry, I'm trying to speed up a bit. So, generally, there's only about 4 slides, I think. Okay. Okay. Well, the one thing I wanted to mention was that we did have the co-flats project in Stroud, which I don't think was publicised very well. That's a good example of one that went wrong because the common spaces were not big enough. But it was aimed at professionals, and I thought that was quite an interesting idea.
Were these existing houses that were knocked together?
I think it was just an old church that was converted. But I thought interesting lesson to learn because it failed, because the spaces were developed was a bit greedy on that one. It shows that it's adaptable to different scenarios. Different sizes can work with different models. It works with both private and state ownership. And the model can work long term. We're talking about 40 years, as we were talking about. In terms of the experience of older people, there were different levels of community support. So for example, in the project in the top image, they had a system where they had a symbol on the door, and in the morning, if the symbol hadn't been rotated, then they'd know that person hadn't got up or it might have fallen. So it was a good way of checking that their neighbours were. It was much more sensitive to the demographic mix in the senior co-housing, I thought. So as you were saying, that if the group of residents are a very similar age, it means that it's difficult to recruit young people. A reluctance in many cases to accept older people over 70 or degenerative illness. So it would be exclusive to, it would be difficult for somebody over 70 to get into projects. A reluctance of older people to move to smaller units. I thought this was very important. So in multi-generational schemes, they have different apartment sizes, and in some of the large units where people have had children, they wouldn't want to move to a smaller unit once their children have moved out. So that was a big problem that used to be. And one woman knew that she wasn't going to be alive in 4 or 5 years, so she didn't want to invest in a heating system. So that was a bit of a morbid example. Some of the reasons for failure, I think this is quite important for us to look at. These are just some things I've thought about. Some of the projects have lost the key visionary resident or the kind of shapers and movers that started the project. So they kind of lost that energy that we were talking about. The lack of communal space, so the common space was too small. Poor location of design or common spaces. We were talking about the location of common spaces earlier on. I was really disappointed to find that the common spaces were relocated poorly or really poorly designed in projects that were 10 years after the originals. So there's lots of things we could be learning from in terms of mistakes from earlier projects. Poor adaptations over time. This is quite interesting. So for example, in one of the projects, they had designed it so that the corridors would allow to look into the common areas, but because fire regulations were improved, they then had to build walls in, so that this can ruin the whole idea really, and it became a very horrible environment. In central Vernon, which was a really nice project, they had windows which looked into the central streets, but people couldn't block them up. So that's kind of an occupant user problem. And there were lots of examples where common space was located below ground level or very difficult to see into. So no one used the space. There's lots of other examples in the report in more detail. So in terms of design is really important and integral into the way in which each community functions. I thought the small details can make a really big difference. It's almost like some people call it blue jeans architecture. It's not about having really amazing grand visions, but it's about making the small things work sometimes. I saw lots of innovation, which I tried to document in the report. Some ideas worked well and some didn't, but I think there's a real lack of post-occupancy evaluation. I think we need to be learning from this vast amount of knowledge and experimentation. Like I said, repeated mistakes, I thought it was really depressing to see. I thought architects have let a lot of these projects down. And the project scale was very important. This is the last slide, by the way. So I guess the game changes, although maybe not. I don't know. So learning from past mistakes in a variety of projects. We need to learn more from previous projects. Some projects are under-publicised. On the journey, I encountered some really interesting projects. There was one in Sweden, for example, where they had social housing. They had co-housing, but it was mixed with state services. So during the working hours of the day, the state used those kind of facilities for helping people with disabilities or very old people who required extra care. And in the evenings, the community would use it. So essentially, they had twice the amount of funding for their common spaces and it was shared. But I don't know if that was working in this country because it's not a state. The state doesn't have control. And high density projects, I think we could be looking more focused on some of the high density schemes like in Sweden, which we're looking at how this can work in London and other cities. And I also think a lot of the focus is on families and older people. I think it's fair enough, but I also think there are big opportunities for young professionals. We're starting to see some innovation in the more recent years. We're now seeing Copper Lane, I think, which is probably one of the smallest projects, And I don't know how many of you heard about the Collective in London, which is this project of about 500 people. This is aimed very much at young people, and I think there's criticism of it because it's a private model. It's been designed by a private developer. It means that young people can live in this block, but they only pay a very small amount less than a normal unit.
So 13 square meters a room.
Yes, you have a very tiny room, but you have a very. But when I think about it, I really enjoyed living in quarter residence when I was in London. I enjoyed living in group housing, and I actually think there are things about it that would really work. So, if it could be run by housing associations.
Is this the Royal Oak? That waste land?
It is. Okay. Yes.
Nothing around it at all.
Yes, it's a depressing location. Look, I'm not advocating this particular project because I don't agree with everything about it. But I think there's lots of things that are quite exciting about it and could be used.
It's also very, very publicised. So it's really a project that
Yes.
It's very, they really have it's very new that people hear about it now.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that we shouldn't just ignore it. Is what I'm saying. I think we should pay a lot of attention to this. And we need more support in this country to encourage innovation. I think it was amazing what the Dutch government did back in the 70s, where they were actually enabled communities to quite a big scope of innovation and control. I think maybe we should have grants perhaps if possible, or you need to support it better, basically. Yeah, I think that might be a bit fast, but I've gone over, but that's it. So thanks. Just to mention, everything that I've mentioned is much more detailed, much better written and laid out in the report. It's got a very long and complicated link, so if you just go to architecture.com and type in John Kellogg, then you'll find it.
Now, in the interest of focusing our minds, I'm asking Louise to drill down to 2 or 3 main points, and then we'll take a quick break, and then we'll have a final concluding discussion to think about what messages we want to convey tomorrow, because there's been a lot in this afternoon's discussion about what we want.
Thanks very much. So just to introduce myself, my name is Louise. I'm a core social leadership fellow, so I have recently completed a piece of research into sustainable development, exploring opportunities in Germany, the Netherlands and Denmark. I also work for an organisation called The Limited, which is the Foundation for Social Entrepreneurs, and I've just been awarded a Winston Churchill Fellowship, so I'm actually going to revisit those countries to look at. There are really good examples of these innovations, but actually what is it that local authorities and municipalities are doing to work with the community to enable these things to actually take form and to take shape, and to enable people both within municipalities but also within the community to take a leadership role. So that's kind of really briefly my background. And what I've done with this research is look at, what's lacking in the UK. There is a huge question of finance, and in a small part we've tried to address some of the seed finances that are necessary to enable more co-housing and community-led housing to take form through an innovation fund. So we had worked up a fund originally anticipating giving out £50,000, we ended up giving out just over 100,000 to individuals who've got ideas to build community resilience. And so we've just backed 12 individuals, 2 of which are in the room at the moment. And some of the lessons I would suggest is the fact that we kept it broad. We've got a really interesting cohort of individuals with some really interesting ideas, not specifically looking at housing, but also looking at how you can make homes more ecological, and developing a peer-to-peer learning network. So kind of replicating some of the stuff that's going on through this seminar series, but working with a group of activists, stroke entrepreneurs who are actually provide some of these solutions for their communities. So some of the lessons kind of early on are how we look at systems change, disrupting the financial systems that are in place that are preventing some of these things from coming to fruition, and to disrupting some of the systems. And there are things like the Whittle House Foundation, who are on the programme, we were looking at how do you stop the model of housing that we've got in the UK from a few very large developers to actually anybody can develop. There were creative commons that we can put in place to enable people to look at really good systems sustainable developments, and communities can take ownership of those. Looking at peer-to-peer financing, so as well as the funds that are limited to putting in, actually a lot of huge players in the UK are really interested in this idea of place-based investment, building community resilience. Organisations like the Local Trust, Big Society Capital, there's a huge amount of talk about place. So if we can change the way that we're framing cohousing perhaps a little, think about the broader sense of sustainable development and how that might fit into the way that we're developing places, and that actually might become really attractive to these big funders who are thinking about how they can have a sustainable and more long-term impact on the places that they want to work in. And yeah, some of the attitudes in my research show some of the things. One thing that I have stolen from Copenhagen actually is that we should think about considering urban life before urban space and urban space before buildings. And I think that originated from Copenhagen, but I think this is really telling about their attitude and the attitude that we can have about, first and foremost, it's about people, about how we want to live and interact with each other, and from that, we can use all of the issues that we're trying to tackle through cohousing to think about how we can turn those into opportunities. The power of the collective and people and networks like this who are willing to give energy and time to each other and share the lessons, whether some of those might be the lessons of failure. There's still a lot of things that we can celebrate from that. And I'll leave it there. So I know this question time. But if anyone wants to connect with me, then you can get in touch through Twitter or through Unlimited.
Thank you.
We don't want to have the exercise, the risk assessment form, the health and safety, field trip. Yes, I did all that when I take my students to Copenhagen. Do not fall off a bicycle. Scald your fingers. Okay, I'd like to resume this final session, this kind of workshop discussion. We have an opportunity now in quite a sort of compact period of time. So maybe an opportunity for some really succinct nuggets of insight to come from as many people as possible to really have this collaborative open forum. A lot today to digest, reminding us that this is a sort of a recap of some big themes, but it's about this today is really getting down to the pragmatism, the translating inspiration into reality. We've been talking about mainstreaming and what might be the opportunities and barriers. So what I thought we'd do is have an opportunity first and foremost to sort of recap on those key points, and we'll try and note this down so we can add it to our distillation of lessons to be learnt from the seminar series as our kind of ongoing reporting mechanism, but also then to draw from that maybe some key questions, particularly ones we might want to put to politicians or policymakers. Bearing in mind that for those of you who are joining us tomorrow we are kind of we're reconvening at 10 AM in Portcullis House, which is part of the Parliament. It's not in the House of Commons itself, but part of that parliamentary setup. And we are taking this report, we're actually blocking out the ESRC because we're obliged to do this for benefit, hosted by Richard Bacon MP, and with an audience of practitioners, politicians, policymakers, and many of yourselves. We're going to take this report which includes, and I won't show it up now, but after we've had some thoughts, show what it is that we've so far got as a sort of shopping list menu of policy asks, what it is we think are the blockages to mainstreaming co-housing. But it could well be that, this afternoon adds to that, and this is an ongoing dynamic situation. We use social media, we use our website, we use everything else, so we can add to all this. So you'll contribute to that process.
Can I just say, is there anybody here who hasn't received an invitation and would like to come tomorrow?
I think Jim might join you. Did you get it? Okay. You did get one.
If anybody needs an invitation to register online, just email me, please, or
yeah. And we will wrap up this session with a further reminder of what to do, where to go, and also the reminder of how to keep connected with us through our website. We haven't got this report available today because it's being launched tomorrow, but for anyone not coming tomorrow, it's going to be available in a downloadable version from tomorrow on multiple websites. We'll point you to them, as well as the video that some of you saw earlier on, and future to be made. So that's enough from me. I just want to open up to the floor in terms of this forum. And let's try and keep lots of succinct sort of ideas. Throw it all into it.
Yes.
And do introduce yourself to James.
Yes, James Leeson from Your Space, Co-Housing in Europe. Picking up on what Michael was saying earlier in the day, and this may be a question to be posed tomorrow, is how do we develop like a better argument to convince local authorities to dispose of public assets that doesn't have a focus on capital value? Because I mentioned the project earlier that we weren't successful in that bid because someone offered £2.5 million more than we did. And the amount that we offered was a value that was independently assessed for that land. So we offered what someone thought it was worth. So for co-housing groups to make them affordable, we need to find a way to come up with an argument that convinces local authorities to sell on that basis, because if they're going to sell to the highest bid, it's only going to exacerbate the problem, which is the house prices in this country.
Sorry, I'm just trying to make it so that
and it's a very difficult argument because the council have lots of pressures. And when you speak to people in the council, like I did in the assets team, and I said, well, what does it mean to you, these cuts? And he says, well, I either have to make 30% cuts, and then so I have to raise money to sell off land for a higher value, or I have to sack people in my department because we haven't got enough finance. So it's a very difficult argument to pose to local authority. So I think when Michael was saying about coming up with a strong argument, a strong case for the quantifying the social community value of these projects, I appreciate this is very succinct. But you know, we on our bid for that particular site we tried to buy off the council, we quantified what 25% of our residents being elderly and not being in care would save the council. They basically rubbished that and said they were highly speculative and the council were never going to see those. So I think if anyone's got any good ideas for how to try and...
Can I just ask if the social impact assessment that you talked about earlier on, if that is kind of what we're talking about here?
Sort of, especially councils.
Is there any way you can just chip in so with our live streaming, and it just maybe makes a lot more sense to you hearing over Fion's shoulder? Yeah, that'd be great.
So I was talking to Maria about social impact measurement using SROI, social return on investment, or social auditing. There's other models, but are very difficult to do for community groups or anyone really, very complex. What I'm interested in with councils is use the Social Value Act 2013, which is usually about procurement. And so they have a hard time relating to land. But if you've got policies that refer to the Social Value Act, then you can start to quote them back to your council. So that's what we're trying to do in Oxford, is to get Social Value Act policies going. And we've got councils working on that. It's not easy. It's not familiar to them. And at the same time, we've valued all the other things we were talking about. We've valued things like right to buy, and the effect that has on losing stock and then falling into the private rental sector. We value carbon, which is much easier to do, because we've got a long history of it. Things that are kind of social and less tangible, you've got to make some pretty big assumptions, and then also got to accept those assumptions. So if there's better toolkits that are easier to use, or if there's kind of more funding for professionals to kind of come through and give it over to people who can definitely do it straight away. I know there is some, but working out how to get the community groups connected to make those cases.
So anyone else got, Michael, you've got some...
Well, what comes to mind right away from you in Berlin is whether, I think you mentioned too about an important one that's been working for people in Berlin or Germany, is that as long as people are doing housing, so to speak, for themselves, right, then it's like wonderful, do it somewhere, but don't expect to see it from government. There's at least more interest when you say, well, we'll throw on some kind of services for the community. And this can be a daycare, this can be something. What is it that the neighborhood needs? That takes it 20 steps further. Or if some jobs are going to some kind of commercial space that's missing. So it is a hard one. If so I said, all you're saying you do is you're creating some form of affordable housing for ourselves and for certain people. I think that's wonderful, but they don't see really what these benefits, especially if their mindset is already, well, housing is a competitive thing, people should find what they're able to get and pay for it.
Okay. Okay, we've got some other thick and fast. We're going to keep this going with conversation. Comments or questions, Martin, and then Andrea, and then.
I'd reiterate a point about the authority policies. Because if you think part of the sector's enabling framework is a policy development framework, and then be in place in terms of housing strategies, local development plan strategies, or spatial strategies. And if there's an explicit policy framework there that talks about supporting community-led housing of one kind or another through one means or the other, and individual groups aren't, if that's in place in a locality, and some work's been done looking at like in London, there's a few local authorities in London that have explicit policies like that, usually for something like East London, land trust or some self-build policies. But if it's there, then individual groups don't have to break their backs creating that wheel time and time again. And the flexibility of them to enable more than one sort of policy to come ahead and claim already some of the social value type arguments that Charlie just mentioned as an excuse for local groups to be able to get access to some resources.
Okay, Andrea.
Just to
speak up because I'm trying to.
Yeah. Okay, Andrea Jones, University of Sussex. But just going back to your point at your walk and the arguments of local authority, I totally agree with what you say. We have to dovetail with what local authorities have already to do, and we just have to be intelligent about whether we do that. Residential care is not a kind of good answer, a good argument for local authorities, because only under 2% of people end up in residential care in Little Island. So it's not volume for them. The vast majority of people over 65 in the UK end up in their own homes, owner occupiers, until death. And then they end up in hospital maybe for a brief period at the end. That's the vast majority. So the real issue around support for other people and that well-being that comes from these communities has to be around quality of life and releasing housing that old people stay in until they die. Often family homes, 3-bedroom houses, it has to be that big picture, which is probably, maybe local authorities aren't quite seeing that, but that's the big picture about releasing housing, not residential care. And so the stories of care, like Algie told, those are good, the quality of our stories of care are good, but the real money lies in privately owned occupation, the real release of housing capacity.
Okay, yeah, nice and short. Okay.
Put out the NHS onto that though. I mean, the NHS has got loads of land everywhere. And it would save a huge amount through the co-housing model if you thought in those terms. It's just,
I've got a few questions here. Okay, very
just
quickly.
comment on that, but to answer that, social care costs of inappropriate housing and isolation have been massively evidenced. You'll find estimates ranging from £1 spent on housing, £20 saved in social care upwards. And there are studies showing that.
But it doesn't fall to the local authorities, it's not their budget.
It does, the social care budget is a local authority budget.
Yeah, it is, but the vast majority.
The trouble is they don't make that connection.
But the vast majority of social care money comes from individual householders. It's paid for by individual householders. It's not the vast majority of that care, but the whole money business is not. It's paid for by individuals.
Let's try and open out beyond care as well, just to bring all the other, just only because we don't want to get too into silent. Nice and.
Yeah, I'll keep very short. I think the opportunities under this localism agenda for community housing, but our immediate interface is always the local authority, and they are being severely weakened by the same, agenda of the Canadian European government that we have. So I think this is maybe something we take time because it's like we're going in the void.
Contradictions there. Yeah. The thoughts opening out this. Fionn.
No, I just wanted to speak back again about one of the ideas that came out today about, okay, in the face of the neoliberal austerity agenda, maybe we do need to open out and work more with private organisations who can offer some of the enabling that is now missing from some of the local authorities. And I know that might sound quite controversial, but I actually think that's pragmatic. And I think what fair housing needs to do at the moment is very pragmatic.
I saw a flurry before. Martin will come back.
I wanted to say something about design. And it was about maybe the different comments that were made about greenhouse design. And I wonder if there's I wonder if there's a challenge that co-housing schools still presented with in getting across the element in which co-housing is both about co-living as much as about co-housing. You're going to be good at finding housing for people, and you think the design of the housing is a really particular way, but maybe not so well accomplished in thinking about how you enable the community dynamics to go on. I'm very struck by what was said about groups looking at where to place the co-housing, and particularly out thinking it's got to be a gateway. Because you can find still schemes who are placing community housing, playing useful community positions. And I'm thinking, for example, there's one in Scotland that was done a couple of years ago, developed with it, and it's tucked over at the back. It's not nowhere near the actual properties or near the road and access. And even the properties are, you could say, arranged in an odd system. But I wonder if it's because that co-dynamic of what co-housing represents is seen as more incidental along the lines of co-housing, that incidental contact, rather than about a necessity. And if you look at the common property, common housing facilities as an absolute necessity for interaction, I think you would never put something at the back of the scheme. Whereas if you think about it, maybe it's incidental and you think of it as a community centre, and people always want to centre away from the buildings. You're not thinking about the essences of co-housing in terms of that community dynamic. And I just wonder whether that's still a challenge that co-housing has got to get to in any English context.
I'll take that up. It's a really interesting point, and there is a suspicion in English culture of anything collaborative, collective, or communal. Equally important, I think, to the location and design of the co-house is the fact that everybody has their own front door. Because at any time of day or life, you may want to be actually not interacting with your neighbours, but then the design of the space will encourage you to be able to do that. So it's about enabling that interaction, not forcing it. And there's poor housing design, co-housing, other housing, which is overly intimate and makes public spaces that can't be used because they're too intimate. So it is really, it is a delicate balance, and it's also a delicate linguistic challenge to portray that in the right way, I think, as an opportunity. And I like the light contact idea that Anna came up with, phrase, expression. I think that's a good expression.
It kind of links to Michael's point as well, though, and I think it also, one of the previous seminars, we had Irina Bahnman gave us a very good sort of like snappy recap of a very sort of critical debate around financing co-housing, where quite often it's about how can groups fund themselves, this idea of providing affordable housing, which primarily is member benefit, and challenging that by seeing co-housing as a much more porous and something that has a sort of almost a wider footprint and a trickle out value, rather than scaling up to the model of co-housing, but scale out the benefits of co-housing to the wider society as a demonstration of social value. And I think, there's a design challenge there, and there's a social challenge. The design challenge is, you place your common amenities on the perimeter because you want to invite, windows into the wider world. You want to invite interaction and shared use. And I love the idea of a mixed use idea being some way of actually having that bigger appeal. But you also do so socially as well, because, you want to not erect the idea, false image of some sort of, cliquey, haven of tranquility for some people. But yes, and there's a comment. Okay, and then that's just kind of.
I just had a question. Yes. So if Parliament asks, where should we allocate? Like they say hypothetically speaking that they'll give funding and provide incentives, so on and so forth. If they ask how much resources should go to London, how much resources should go to Midlands, how does one answer that question in terms of resources that should be allocated on a geographic basis?
I don't think funding is allocated, but I'm not the expert to be able to do that. It tends to be that it's actually, we talk about local authorities in terms of, but there's true that the housing crisis has been framed as a London crisis, whereas actually the housing crisis permeates all places, and it has locally distinct features. But who wants to pick this up then?
I just want to add one point. Somebody mentioned about places where local authorities are giving away land for like benefit for a town.
Yeah.
Somebody in a presentation, and that happens in Birmingham. I want to bring that happens in
yeah. Well, it happens in Newcastle. We've got some buildings short lease. Yeah, maybe it doesn't happen in London. Not so much in London. Okay, yes. Well, there's probably a reason for that. But Angela, do you want to come forward and peer over Fion's shoulder? She loves Friends. Peer down so you're in the view.
If you go to do, under the localism bill, where they've tried to encourage people to actually, do more things themselves instead of rely upon the government. If you go to do something like a, free school proposal, they've got something called the New Schools Network, and there's funded people there that can help you do applications, that can point you in the right direction, and whatever. And it just feels like there needs to be something like that, because this is even more complicated, because you can't get anything going in a way until you've got the central point and possibly land, and so to actually be able to bring some of those resources together into, to encourage groups to have, some help, really,
Could you, Louise and then, yeah.
So I just wanted to pick up a couple of points. I think it's what you suggested about the Social Value Act and replicating that with how we value land is a really key point, because that's something that politicians actually could have a huge influence over. And when you look at the impact that that's having on social enterprises, it's still getting there. It's a bit of a carrot and stick at the moment, and there have been a few tests that have come through to look at how that can be applied. But I think that the impact of that can be quite significant. So certainly the application of social value act to land. If you look at the New Economics Foundation, they've looked at various different tools for looking at how you measure social benefit, and some of that is around local benefit and something called the LM3. So for local authorities, you can demonstrate how much of the money that they might give to you is going to be retained in the local economy. That's actually very attractive to them. It doesn't necessarily predicate you looking at things that they might say, well, that's your judgment on how much is going to save us in the long term. Third is that not being a big developer whose first and foremost decision is how much money am I going to make out of this development, actually could give a lot of agility to co-housing initiatives. You might be able to look at the idea of having these clusters. So I'm just thinking, I'm from Birmingham, and there have been a lot of discussions around Dublin's recently about there are really unattractive little plots of land that developers aren't interested in. So if you have 4 or 5 of those in a fairly condensed location that actually could act as kind of clusters of co-housing, then that might mean you could get around the argument, there's not going to be anyone who's interested in it, it's just not very attractive. And it could we look at a new way of modelling co-housing so that we can take advantage of those things. And then the fourth being that a lot of the EU discussions about sustainable development is looking at this idea of being more productive. And so not just about how sustainable is the development that you're looking to develop, but actually what are they putting into the community, how can they put these resources or provide services to the community. So I think this is a really key point.
That's some great points there. There was a couple of others. It was Michael next, and then there was Martin. Yeah, someone else before that earlier. Michael? Yeah. No, not.
I'm just happy with you.
Okay. But, just bring Charlie back, because okay, Martin and then Charlie.
There is this £60 million that the budget has identified for the housing scheme at the moment, and the parameters for that, I understand, are still being finalised. Predominantly coastal and rural based communities. And yes, you can see all sorts of political spin on that. But it's there, and there's another pot of money from the National Foundation which can be managed to locality to support community housing schemes that
got an imminent deadline because we're working on it as well. Yeah, August 1st, I think. Yeah. Charlie, you had a point?
So as I say, if all of the genuinely affordable grant funding has come out of the affordable grants programme this year, so we can assume they're not going to support any social housing. But social investment tax relief and other ways of incentivising communities to invest in low rates would be very useful. I don't know where grant is ever going to come from. We've got to work at ways of doing schemes at very low interest rates and make money mixes. So that's social investment tax relief for this kind of thing.
At this point, I just thought I might, because we've got about 10 minutes more in, so I might only move along. I'm just going to put up on the screen the policy asks and see whether it puts up any kind of, so I don't know if you want to read this. Can you sharpen this? Helen, do you want to spin the camera? Yes, I will. I'm just multitasking things. There you go. It's going to be back to front, that scene of things, so we can't do that. It's not going to work. No, it's not going to work. We'll have to look at you instead. You have to just speak it through. Someone else can. For instance, I'll read them out. I mean, basically, I haven't got mine in front of me. We look at from central government, local government, from practitioners, from lenders, and from co-housing group activists. Is it worth me reading them out, or you can read that? Okay, so I'll read them out for the benefit of the live streaming. So from central government, we're asking, rather than providing housing for people, change the political and cultural framework to enable people to do it themselves. Actually, I can read it from my report. Can you speak it from my? Because I can't. If I then I can speak it to them. Yeah, just chuck it up to them. That's great. Rather to improve legal mechanisms to enable safeguard and develop shared ownership of goods. Engage more with co-housing initiatives and the community housing movement. We seem to be debating whether it's community-led or community housing. It seems to be using the phrase community housing. But that's what we mean. Ensure that policy initiatives aimed at doubling custom and self-build activity by 2020 work to improve access to funding and land for collective projects like co-housing, as well as for individual custom builders. So those are kind of like 4 bullet points at the moment from central government, bearing in mind that central government drive a sort of tone of funding, but they don't actually allocate much of funding. Most of that, we want to move down to local. The local government is a bit more specific in terms of drilling down to funding associated with localism and local plans. But more importantly, and key is here, make more land available, especially in urban areas. And we draw on the excellent example here. In Germany, for instance, state and local authorities may provide preferential access to public land for Baugruppen at a fixed price. You can confirm whether that's true or not. And in some instances, the municipality will also put in sustainable infrastructure beforehand to create service plots. Now, there is some indication that some of that's on the cards here, but clearly we don't have that practice at the moment. Second, facilitate the formation of intentional community groups and help them navigate the challenges of designing and building co-housing projects. I think we could be thinking about the social enabler there, who might also be the financial enabler if the 2 roles are rolled into one. And third, take account of quality of life issues and inclusive decision making when formulating planning policies and decisions. So that's sort of central and local government, what we're kind of asking, and you might want to be forming ideas of anything that we've missed from that. And then scrolling down, we've got from social and private developers, of which we've heard today, there's kind of a mixed inclination to form partnerships, a willingness, and we don't quite know where the obstacles there. I mean, sometimes it's lack of willingness, sometimes it's lack of knowledge or risk. Provide a common communal space building on every new housing estate. So to mainstream through basically retrofitting into ordinary streets and neighbourhoods. And second, to integrate co-housing and other forms of community housing into mainstream housing and its funding structure. So the one idea would be to add maybe a request on waiting lists. Are people looking for co-housing when looking for social housing? We heard, for example, about a development in Melbourne, Australia, and this is one of the seminar speakers who came to visit us where 60% of a common equity. So in Melbourne, Australia, that is 60% private and 40% common equity rental cooperative. And they talked it a sort of speckled or salt and pepper development where you couldn't actually distinguish the private from the common equity rental. This was aesthetically a large development where those common equity rentals were integrated within that whole. And then from lenders, to work with the sector to improve the financial products available to incipient co-housing communities and to exchange knowledge about what lenders and groups require from each other. We've talked a little bit about the lender's role here, so that might be one of the ones that's still a little bit vague because we haven't necessarily got, lenders haven't really contributed to us what the barriers are. And then finally from co-housing groups, of which we've had some great participation over the course of these seminars, so we've got a good sense. But this is kind of what we're asking co-housing groups to sort of contribute to this transition from art into reality. Consider demographic balance in community activities and formation, ensure that decisions about procurement are made inclusively, and look for ways to incorporate and support sustainable technologies in design, construction and operation. Those asks are a little bit different there, I suppose about the contract of if state support is being given to community-led, community-built, self-built co-housing communities, there has to be a tacit understanding that it's about inclusive, not member benefit design. So that's kind of it's awkward reading through that list, and you've seen through this. But I mean, does that trigger any thoughts about any gaps or other final thoughts? We do have only 1 or 2 minutes, so 5 minutes. Oh, that's good topic. But just to sort of wrap up with any final thoughts, Kath has got an idea, and then Anna.
I think that we could ask for something from central and or local government about standardization of standardizing the way that land is valued, the treatment of community, of social benefit. If there was some Martin was calling for a policy framework, and some individual local authorities have adopted their own, but other local authorities have, and it's usually the borough solicitor who's the bad guy who says you're not allowed to consider anything except purely financial value. So if there were a clear, uniform treatment of this across the country, I think that would help a lot.
A national policy framework.
Yeah.
A national policy framework for land value, social land value.
Social land value.
Okay. And then Anna had a question, if you can come into frame.
Complement the land discussion, but it was to pick up on something that Patrick said, which was about planning system. The planning system being very integral actually to the land value, but actually a real barrier to actual co-housing groups. If you've been successful enough to secure land or a site, you then have a whole host of barriers where the planning system is set up culturally to deliver the standard house types. It doesn't understand co-housing at all. And therefore makes the whole process very expensive as well as a very drawn out process. So if there's something we could add into there about looking at those elements of the planning system that is complex.
Many of these things are going to be picked up tomorrow. This is more of a theme that's going forward tomorrow. And this is a good point to recap the idea that you're all invited to the parliamentary launch of this report in a kind of political, compelling case-making situation tomorrow, which is what that's about. We have kind of run out of time, but I wanted to sort of wind up by, we've gone through the big concepts, the big issues, right back, as we often do in these seminars, back to the more everyday dilemmas that are very real and very pressing, and they are the challenges in terms of getting projects developed. and it often feels like it's leaving conversations hanging. There's plenty of opportunities to continue conversations through the UK Co-Housing Network. I mean, these policy asks are being formulated and kept going and sustained through the network's activity, who of course is an active partner in this action research programme, and that partnership is going to be, I hope, ongoing, because the UK Co-Housing Network is all about advocacy, but also about fostering a climate in which some evidence-based research is stimulated. And the other point to make is that conversations need to continue after this event through all the social media websites and contact lists that we have circulated over time. We have got a GIST mail mailing list that many of you are on. If you want to keep the conversation going and don't feel you're hearing about all these things, then just email me or Kath or Melissa and we'll add you to that mailing list or invite you to join. Because we don't want these events to be standalone events. They're part of, network building. We particularly want to hear from individuals who have formed conversations, chats in the tea break, and from that have then gone on, as I know that Charlie has done, sort of taken lilac ideas into Oxford, for instance, and we want to hear those stories because they're part of what really is demonstrating the unmet potential and the groundswell of interest.
Might take a photo of everybody.
Yes, do, yeah. So I think, unless there are any final sort of positives, I think I'd like to thank very much Kath and Melissa for fantastic organising something like this in London, prime real estate, finding room, space, hotels, getting people. I mean, it might be easier to lure people to London than it does to Newcastle, for instance, but it's organisationally much more challenging, and we've done a phenomenal job, so I'd like to thank Melissa.